My son-in-law never knew I owned the company where he works as a director. I always let him believe I was just a simple old man surviving on a meager pension. But everything changed the day he laid his hands on my daughter. 2 minutes later, he realized exactly who I was and the empire he had just awakened. Before I tell you how I dismantled his entire life piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a father must protect his daughter at all costs. The heavy scent of hickory smoke and sweet brown sugar barbecue sauce hung in the thick July air. I stood quietly over the massive stainless steel grill in the backyard of my daughter Maya and her husband Bradley's sprawling suburban estate. The house was magnificent with its towering white columns and perfectly manicured green lawns. I wore my usual faded gray sweatpants and a weathered gardening jacket. I liked it that way. Being invisible gave me a front-row seat to the truth. And the truth about Bradley Preston was loud and arrogant. A few yards away, Bradley was holding court with his corporate buddies, holding a craft beer and wearing a crisp designer polo shirt. His voice carried effortlessly over the smooth rhythm and blues music playing from the expensive outdoor speakers. "Look at him," he chuckled, pointing his expensive cigar in my direction. Maya insisted we invite her dad. The guy was a janitor or a handyman or something his whole life. Now he just comes over here to eat my food and mess up my patio. His friends laughed, those hollow, privileged laughs that always made my stomach turn. Bradley puffed his chest out, taking another sip of his expensive beer. But hey, I can afford it. When I get that vice president promotion at Sterling Holdings on Monday, this house is getting a massive upgrade. I might even hire the old man to trim the hedges so he can finally make himself useful. I kept turning the ribs, letting the heat sear the meat. I did not say a single word. Bradley had been a director at Sterling Holdings for 3 years. He drove a luxury car leased by my company. He spent company money on lavish client dinners and expensive golf trips. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the mysterious founder of Sterling Holdings was some unseen corporate ghost who lived in a high-rise. He never bothered to look closely at the signature on his paychecks. If he had, he might have recognized the handwriting of the quiet old black man currently flipping his ribs. When Maya was a little girl, I worked 3 jobs just to put food on the table. My wife passed away when Maya was only 4 years old, leaving me to raise our little girl all by myself. I promised my late wife on her deathbed that I would give our daughter the world. And I did. I built Sterling Holdings from a single beat-up delivery box truck into a nationwide logistics and real estate empire. I made sure Maya went to the best schools, had the best clothes, and never had to worry about a single bill. But I also taught her to be humble. I drove an old truck. I lived in a quiet neighborhood. I never flashed my wealth because I wanted my daughter to value character over cash. Unfortunately, her humility is exactly what made her a target for a predator like Bradley. He saw a quiet, beautiful woman who did not care about designer labels, and he assumed she was weak. He assumed she came from nothing. The sliding glass door rattled open and Maya stepped out, her face tight with a familiar anxiety. My beautiful baby girl with her rich brown skin and bright, intelligent eyes looked exhausted. She was 32 years old, but today she carried the weight of a woman twice her age. Bradley snapped his fingers at her like she was a waitress serving his table. "Maya, where is the silver wine opener? The guys want to open the Cabernet I bought in Napa." I could see her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her apron. "I cannot find it, Brad. I think it might be in the dishwasher. I can use the standard one from the drawer." Bradley slammed his beer bottle down on the glass patio table, making everyone jump. The laughter died instantly. "I did not ask for the standard one, Maya. I asked for the silver one." He marched past his silent friends and followed her back into the kitchen, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind them. My chest tightened. I put the steel tongs down on the side of the grill. For months I had noticed the small, disturbing changes in Maya. The way she flinched when he spoke too quickly. The way she constantly apologized for things that were not her fault. She used to be so full of life, so independent and fierce. Now she walked on eggshells in her own home, terrified of waking the dragon. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked slowly toward the house. Through the glass, I could see Bradley backing her into the granite kitchen island. I opened the door just enough to hear his voice hissing with venom. You embarrass me in front of my colleagues. You cannot even do one simple thing right. You are useless, Maya. I give you this beautiful house I pay for your clothes, and you cannot even find a damn wine opener." Maya kept her voice low, trying to placate him like a frightened child. "Please, Brad. They can hear you outside. Stop it. I will look for it again. Do not tell me what to do in my own house, you ungrateful idiot." The sound that followed echoed through the pristine kitchen and shattered the world into a million jagged pieces. It was a sharp, vicious crack. I watched in slow, excruciating motion as Bradley swung his heavy hand and slapped my daughter directly across the face. The force of the blow was sickening. It knocked Maya completely off balance. She stumbled backward, her hip hitting the sharp edge of the marble counter before she crumpled to the hardwood floor. Time stopped. The rhythm and blues music outside faded into dead white noise. I pushed the sliding door open so hard it slammed violently against the metal tracks. I stepped into the kitchen, my heavy work boots thudding against the polished floorboards. Maya was on the ground holding her cheek, tears welling in her terrified eyes. A dark red mark was already blooming across her beautiful skin. Bradley stood over her, his chest heaving, his face flushed with unhinged rage. He did not look sorry. He did not look ashamed. He looked annoyed that she had fallen. I did not yell. I did not rush at him or throw a punch. Anger is a weapon, but control is an empire. I walked calmly over to my daughter and knelt down, taking her shaking hands in mine. I helped her stand, putting my body firmly between her and the man who had promised God he would protect her. Bradley scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Oh, great. The handyman comes to the rescue. Take her. She is acting crazy anyway and ruining my Sunday." I looked at the red handprint forming on my daughter's face. The rage burning inside my chest was absolute a roaring inferno, but I kept my voice dead quiet and steady. "You struck my child." Bradley rolled his eyes and reached into his designer leather wallet. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and threw it directly at me. It hit my chest before it fluttered pathetically to the floor. "Take your burnt ribs and leave, old man. This is my house, my wife, and my rules. You are lucky I even let a retired janitor on my property. Take your daughter and get out of my sight. But remember, if she leaves me, she gets absolutely nothing. I make $1 million a year. She has no money and no power. I have the best lawyers in the city. I will leave her begging on the streets." I looked down at the $100 bill on the floor. Then I looked up at Bradley Preston. His arrogant smirk made my blood run ice cold. He truly believed he was the king of the world. He truly believed wealth gave him the right to buy people and break them. I reached into the pocket of my faded gardening jacket. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out an old black flip phone. The exact kind of cheap, outdated phone Bradley had made fun of countless times at family dinners. I flipped it open and pressed a single speed dial number. Bradley laughed a cruel, mocking sound that echoed in the kitchen. "What are you doing, old man?" "Calling the cops." "Go ahead. Who do you think the police are going to believe? The wealthy corporate executive in the nice neighborhood or the broke black guy in sweatpants?" I ignored his pathetic racism. The line picked up on the very first ring. The sharp professional voice on the other end belonged to Marcus, my chief of security at Sterling Holdings. "Go ahead, Mr. Sterling," Marcus said immediately. I kept my eyes locked dead onto Bradley's pale, smug face. Freeze all of Bradley Preston's access codes. Yes, company credit cards, building access server logins, and executive banking accounts. Effective immediately. The kitchen was dead silent. Bradley stared at me, his smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second before he burst into a loud, condescending laugh. He shook his head, walking over to the stainless steel refrigerator to grab another beer. "You are pathetic," he sneered, popping the cap off the bottle and taking a sip. "You really think pretending to be some big corporate boss on a $10 flip phone is going to scare me? You are a nobody, Jerome. A poor, pathetic nobody." I did not bother explaining. The trap was already set, and the jaws were closing. I turned my back to him and looked at Maya. I gently wiped a tear from her cheek and kissed her forehead. "Grab your purse, baby girl," I said softly. "We are going home right now." Bradley took another long, arrogant sip of his beer, leaning comfortably against his expensive countertops. "Yeah, run along, Maya," he called out, his voice dripping with venom. But do not bother coming back here. I will have the locks changed by tonight. You are going to crawl back to me begging when you realize you have nothing without my money." I guided my daughter out the front door, leaving the ribs smoking on the grill and the $100 bill sitting on the floor. Bradley Preston thought he had just kicked a helpless old man out of his house. He thought he had won. He did not realize he had just evicted himself from his own life. As I helped Maya into the passenger seat of my old pickup truck, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from Marcus. All accounts locked, all access denied. The destruction of Bradley Preston had officially begun, and he had no idea that the storm coming for him was not a legal battle or a police report. It was an entire unseen empire led by the man he thought was just a janitor. The morning sun poured through the massive bay windows of the master bedroom, casting long, cold shadows across the polished hardwood floor. Monday had officially arrived, bringing with it a harsh and unforgiving reality. I stood in the exact center of my enormous walk-in closet, surrounded by rows of designer dresses, expensive silk blouses, and imported leather shoes that Bradley had purchased for me over the years. None of it mattered to me anymore. I was carefully folding a simple pair of faded denim jeans and placing them into a battered green canvas duffel bag. It was the exact same bag I had owned since my college days. I absolutely refused to take anything that his toxic money had bought. My left cheek still throbbed with a dull and heavy ache from the terrifying violence of the previous night. The bright red handprint had slowly faded into a dark, ugly purple bruise that I could not possibly hide, even if I tried to cover it with heavy makeup. I was moving methodically, trying my hardest to keep my breathing steady, and trying desperately to ignore the overwhelming sense of dread that sat heavy in my chest. My 2 young children were safely at their private elementary school, totally oblivious to the absolute nightmare their home had suddenly become. I knew I needed to pack my things quickly and leave the premises before Bradley returned from his morning corporate meetings. But before I could even zip the first compartment of my suitcase, the heavy oak front door downstairs opened and closed with a loud, echoing thud that shook the walls. I froze completely still. The heavy, rapid footsteps climbing the curved wooden staircase definitely did not belong to my husband. They were the sharp, aggressive clicks of expensive designer heels hitting the floorboards. A brief moment later, the heavy bedroom door swung open violently, hitting the drywall with a loud crack. Susan Preston stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. My mother-in-law was dressed impeccably in a crisp white linen suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her expensive diamond jewelry catching the bright morning light. She had always kept a spare key to our house and used it whenever she pleased. Her cold blue eyes immediately darted to the canvas duffel bag resting on the bed, and her lips instantly curled into a tight, disapproving sneer. "What on earth do you think you are doing, Maya?" she demanded, stepping into my bedroom as if she completely owned it. She did not bother to ask if I was okay. She did not even acknowledge the glaring purple bruise on the side of my face. She simply looked at my packed bag with a toxic mixture of profound annoyance and absolute disdain. I kept my voice as calm and steady as I possibly could, despite the fear rising in my throat. "I am leaving, Susan. Please excuse me because I have a lot of things to pack before your son comes home." Susan let out a sharp, patronizing laugh that chilled me to the bone. She walked confidently over to the bed and casually tossed her expensive leather handbag right on top of my neatly folded clothes. "You are doing no such thing," she said, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You are going to unpack this ridiculous little bag right now, wash your face, put on some makeup, and prepare a nice warm dinner for my son when he gets home. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this entire family over a simple minor misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," I repeated, my voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and intense rising anger. I raised my trembling hand and pointed directly to the dark, swollen bruise on my face. "Your son struck me, Susan. He hit me so hard he knocked me to the kitchen floor. That is not a misunderstanding. That is domestic abuse, and I will not stay here and tolerate it for another second." Susan dramatically rolled her eyes and sighed heavily as if she were dealing with a petulant, stubborn child who did not understand the ways of the real world. Oh, please, Maya, do not be so incredibly dramatic. Bradley is under an immense amount of pressure at work right now. He is about to become a vice president. He carries the heavy weight of the world on his shoulders just to provide you with this lavish, luxurious lifestyle. You intentionally provoked him in front of his important colleagues. You completely undermined his authority in his own home. Important men in his high position have stressful moments and occasionally lose their temper. You simply need to learn how to be a more supportive and quiet wife instead of constantly playing the professional victim. I stared at her, feeling a freezing cold chill run rapidly down my spine. The absolute lack of basic human empathy in her eyes was truly terrifying. But Susan was just getting started with her cruelty. She stepped much closer to me, her strong, expensive floral perfume completely suffocating the small space between us. "Let us be brutally honest with each other right now, Maya," she said, lowering her voice into a deeply menacing whisper. "You should be down on your knees thanking God every single day of your life that a successful man like Bradley chose you. We all know exactly where you came from. You and your father grew up with absolutely nothing. You came from a simple, impoverished working-class background. Bradley elevated you. He brought you into polite, respectable society. He gave you this beautiful, massive home in a safe, affluent neighborhood. He gave you a lifestyle that people from your background only ever get to see in the movies or read about in magazines. And this is exactly how you choose to repay him. By throwing a massive tantrum and trying to run away like an ungrateful, uneducated brat." Her harsh words were deeply laced with heavy racial undertones and blinding, disgusting classism. She had always looked down on me and my hard-working father. She had always viewed my black heritage and my humble beginnings as an ugly stain on her perfect, wealthy white family portrait. To her, I was never a human being or a daughter-in-law. I was simply a charity case that her generous son had graciously adopted to make himself look like a savior. I reached for the handle of my bag, completely ignoring her toxic insults. "I am not having this conversation with you, Susan. Please leave my house immediately." "It is absolutely not your house, Maya," she snapped back, her voice suddenly turning vicious and incredibly loud. "It is my son's house. His hard-earned money pays the massive mortgage every month. His name is the only name on the deed. You own absolutely nothing here." She reached out and violently grabbed my arm, physically pulling me away from the edge of the bed. "And if you think you can just pack a little bag and take my precious grandchildren away from my son, you are completely delusional. Do you really understand who you are dealing with here, Maya? My husband Richard plays golf every single weekend with the top family court judges in this entire state. We have the most aggressive, the most ruthless, and the most expensive lawyers that money can possibly buy on speed dial. If you dare to walk out that front door today, Bradley will file for emergency full custody of those children by tomorrow morning." My heart instantly began to hammer violently against my ribs like a trapped bird. A massive, overwhelming wave of pure panic washed over my entire body. I tried to pull my arm away from her, but her grip was surprisingly strong and painful. "We will paint you as an unstable, violently angry woman," she continued, her pale eyes wide and manic with power. "We will tell the family court that you are currently suffering from a severe mental breakdown. We will testify under oath that you are aggressive and completely unfit to be a mother. Who do you honestly think the old conservative judge is going to believe, Maya? A highly respected, wealthy corporate executive from a prominent, respectable family, or an emotional girl with no job, no money, and a father who does dirty yard work for a living? You will permanently lose your children, Maya. You will be completely out on the streets with absolutely nothing to your name. You will never, ever see your babies again." The psychological gaslighting was incredibly heavy and utterly suffocating. Her cruel words wrapped tightly around my throat like a steel vise. I literally felt the air leave my lungs. For one terrifying, heartbreaking second, I actually believed her lies. I looked around the massive, expensive bedroom and suddenly felt incredibly small and completely powerless. I had absolutely no income of my own. Bradley strictly controlled all the joint bank accounts. He relentlessly monitored my credit cards and my spending habits. I suddenly felt exactly like a helpless prisoner, realizing for the very first time that the invisible walls of her cell were made of solid, unbreakable steel. Hot tears of deep frustration and paralyzing fear pricked the corners of my eyes. Susan immediately saw my sudden hesitation, and she smiled a bright, triumphant, evil smile. She finally released my aching arm and casually smoothed the minor wrinkles from her crisp, white linen suit. "That is exactly what I thought," she said softly, her tone returning to a sickeningly sweet and condescending pitch. "Now be a good smart girl. Unpack this silly little bag, put some cold ice on your bruised face, and we will pretend that none of this unpleasantness ever happened." Just as the heavy, suffocating silence settled deeply over the master bedroom, the loud, sharp musical chime of the front doorbell echoed brightly through the massive house. The unexpected sound violently jolted me out of my paralyzing fear. Susan frowned deeply, clearly annoyed by the sudden interruption to her victory. "Are you expecting a package delivery?" she asked sharply, glaring at the bedroom door. I shook my head slowly, my heart still racing a million miles a minute. I did not order anything today. I quickly walked past her out of the bedroom and headed straight toward the grand curved wooden staircase. Susan followed very closely behind me, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floors. When I finally reached the bottom of the long staircase, I could faintly see two tall, dark figures standing silently behind the frosted glass of the large front door. I reached out with a violently trembling hand and slowly turned the heavy cold brass knob. When the heavy door finally swung open, my breath completely caught in my throat. Standing tall and proud on the concrete front porch was my father, Jerome. He was not wearing his usual faded gray sweatpants or his weathered, dirty gardening jacket. Today, he wore a simple but incredibly sharp and perfectly tailored dark navy blue business suit. He looked incredibly calm, his posture completely straight and totally unyielding. Standing right beside my quiet father was a tall, muscular, broad-shouldered man wearing a flawless custom charcoal gray suit and dark aviator sunglasses. The strange man radiated a quiet but deeply dangerous authority. Before I could even speak a single word of greeting, Susan pushed violently past me, her face contorted with utter disgust and pure arrogance. She looked my father up and down, laughing a harsh, mocking, and deeply insulting laugh. "Oh my goodness," she sneered loudly, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "Jerome! What in the world are you supposed to be all dressed up for? Did you rent that cheap little suit for a funeral today? Or did you actually think putting on a basic tie would magically make you look like you belong in this expensive neighborhood?" My father did not flinch. He did not say a single word in response. He simply looked at Susan with a deep, quiet expression of profound pity. Susan then turned her toxic attention directly to the tall, muscular man standing silently next to my father. She let out another loud, condescending laugh, pointing her manicured finger right at his chest. "And who on earth is this supposed to be? Did you seriously bring your cheap local mall lawyer, Jerome? Do you actually think some pathetic discount attorney you found in the back of the Yellow Pages is going to intimidate my powerful family? My son Bradley makes over $1 million a year. We will completely bury you in massive legal fees before the week is even over." The tall, imposing man in the charcoal suit slowly reached up and took off his dark sunglasses. He looked at Susan with incredibly cold and deeply calculating eyes. He smoothly reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a solid brass security badge, flashing it briefly in the bright morning sunlight. "I am not a lawyer, madam," he said, his voice incredibly deep and strictly authoritative, ringing clearly through the quiet suburban street. "My name is Marcus. I am the Chief Security Officer for Sterling Holdings." Susan aggressively blinked, her mocking, arrogant smile instantly freezing onto her pale face. She looked genuinely confused for the first time. "Sterling Holdings?" she repeated, her voice dropping slightly. "That is Bradley's company. Why would his corporate security team be here at his personal home? Did Bradley send you here for something?" Marcus did not answer her frantic question directly. He smoothly stepped to the side and calmly gestured toward the wide, perfectly paved driveway behind him. "We are here to safely repossess company property, madam." Susan and I both immediately looked past the front porch. Pulling slowly and loudly into the long, sweeping driveway were two massive, heavy-duty commercial tow trucks. Their bright yellow lights were flashing brightly and spinning fast, casting rhythmic, dramatic shadows against the pristine white columns of the large house. The first massive tow truck aggressively backed up toward Bradley's most prized possession, a sleek black imported luxury sports car that cost more than most people's entire homes. The second heavy tow truck quickly maneuvered toward the massive custom luxury SUV that Bradley exclusively drove to his expensive golf tournaments. "What are you doing?" Susan shrieked loudly, her voice suddenly incredibly shrill and deeply panicked. "You absolutely cannot take those vehicles away. Those expensive cars belong to my son. He is a senior executive director at Sterling Holdings. I am calling the local police right now." Marcus pulled a thick, folded legal document from his inside jacket pocket and handed it directly to the trembling Susan. "He does not own them, madam. The vehicles are currently leased under the executive corporate account of Sterling Holdings. As of exactly 8 o'clock this morning, Bradley Preston has been officially stripped of all corporate privileges. We are legally seizing the company assets." The morning traffic was an absolute nightmare, but that was the least of Bradley Preston's problems. He sat in the back of a cheap rideshare vehicle, his face red with profound embarrassment and boiling rage. Just an hour ago, he had watched two massive tow trucks hook up his prized luxury sports car and his custom SUV right out of his own driveway. His frantic phone calls to the corporate fleet manager had gone straight to a disconnected voicemail, leaving him with no choice but to order a budget car service just to get to his own office building. Bradley adjusted his expensive silk tie and glared at the driver's head. He cursed his wife, Maya, and her old father, blaming their stupid family drama for ruining his morning. In Bradley's mind, the towing incident was just a massive clerical error, a stupid administrative glitch that he would brutally punish the accounting department for the second he arrived at his desk. Today was supposed to be the most important day of his professional career. Today, he was officially being promoted to Vice President of Regional Operations at Sterling Holdings. He was about to secure a massive corner office. Nothing was going to ruin his perfect corporate coronation. The car pulled up to the towering skyscraper that served as the global headquarters for Sterling Holdings. Bradley did not bother to say thank you. He shoved the door open and marched aggressively toward the grand revolving doors of the lobby. His shoes clicked sharply against the marble floors, echoing with a heavy, aggressive rhythm. Every employee who crossed his path stepped aside, lowering their eyes to avoid his notorious wrath. He viewed their fear as the ultimate sign of respect. He pushed the button for the elevator, skipping the standard security line. When the sleek silver doors chimed and slid open on the 50th floor, Bradley stormed out like a king returning to his castle. Bradley marched directly toward his office. As he approached his heavy oak desk, he saw his young personal assistant staring frantically at her computer screen. Her hands were trembling. Bradley slammed his heavy leather briefcase down onto her desk. "My cars were towed this morning from my private residence," he barked loudly. "I want you to call fleet management right now and tell them I am going to fire every single one of them before lunch." His assistant swallowed hard, looking completely terrified. "Mr. Preston, I tried to log into your administrative accounts this morning to prepare your promotion paperwork, but the entire system is locking me out. Your corporate email is displaying a critical access. Denied error message," she stammered. Bradley felt a hot flash of extreme irritation rush to his face. He leaned over her desk. "Are you telling me you are too incompetent to call information technology and fix a simple password glitch?" he sneered. "I pay you to make my life perfectly seamless. Fix the computer issue immediately and have my morning espresso waiting for me in the main boardroom. I have my promotion meeting with the executive board in exactly 10 minutes, and I will not allow your pathetic incompetence to ruin my extremely important day." He snatched his briefcase off her desk and turned sharply on his heel. He felt unstoppable. Right now he needed to focus on walking into that grand executive boardroom and taking his rightful place at the top of the corporate food chain. He adjusted his suit jacket, took a deep, confident breath, and marched proudly down the long hallway toward the massive double doors of the main boardroom. He was Bradley Preston, and today he was finally going to own everything. Bradley pushed open the heavy mahogany doors with both hands, entering the massive space like a gladiator stepping into the arena. The room was breathtakingly luxurious, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. In the absolute center of the room sat a massive, custom-built, polished mahogany conference table surrounded by 24 expensive, black leather executive chairs. However, the room was entirely empty, except for one single figure. At the very head of the long table facing the massive glass windows sat someone in the oversized high-back executive leather chair. The chair was turned completely away from the door, so Bradley could only see the back of it. He frowned deeply, his previous arrogance quickly shifting back into boiling irritation. "Who is sitting in that chair?" Bradley demanded loudly, his voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. "I am Bradley Preston, the incoming regional vice president, and you are currently trespassing in a restricted executive meeting space. Turn around and identify yourself immediately before I have building security forcefully remove you from this floor." The large leather chair remained completely motionless for a few agonizing and incredibly deeply tense seconds. Slowly, the heavy chair began to rotate. It turned smoothly on its polished metal base, sliding around to finally face the center of the room. Bradley froze, his breath catching painfully in his throat. His expensive leather briefcase slipped directly from his trembling fingers, hitting the carpeted floor with a heavy, dull thud. Sitting comfortably in the million-dollar executive chair, leaning back with complete relaxed authority, was his father-in-law, Jerome Sterling. The old man was not wearing an expensive designer suit or a silk tie. He was still wearing the exact same weathered green gardening jacket and faded gray sweatpants from the backyard barbecue the previous day. He looked completely out of place in the pristine corporate environment, yet somehow he commanded the massive room with a terrifying absolute presence. Jerome held a simple white ceramic mug in his calloused hands, casually blowing the steam off his hot, black coffee. He did not look angry. He simply looked at Bradley with the same quiet, pitying expression a teacher might give a remarkably slow student. "What in the hell are you doing here?" Bradley whispered, his voice trembling violently as his mind desperately tried to process the reality. "Are you completely out of your mind? Jerome, you are a broke, retired janitor. You cannot just sneak into a corporate headquarters. I will call the police and have you arrested for criminal trespassing." Jerome slowly took a sip of his black coffee, lowering the mug to the polished mahogany table with a quiet, deliberate click. "You are not going to call anyone." "Bradley," he said, his voice low, steady, and incredibly powerful. "You do not have the authority to call security in this building. You do not have the authority to access the computer systems anymore. And as of this morning, you no longer have the luxury cars parked in your driveway." Bradley felt his stomach drop violently into a bottomless pit. The color completely drained from his pale face as the pieces of the puzzle aggressively slammed together in his terrified mind. Sterling Holdings. Jerome Sterling. The realization hit him like a massive runaway freight train. "No," Bradley stammered, taking a weak, trembling step backward. "No, that is impossible. You are a handyman. Maya told me you were completely broke. I let her believe what she needed to believe." Jerome replied calmly. "Character is built in the struggle, not in the inheritance. I built this entire empire from the ground up with my own 2 hands. I own the building you are standing in. I own the chair you sit in, and I own the paycheck that bought the designer suit you are wearing right now." Before Bradley could formulate a single excuse, the heavy mahogany doors behind him swung open. The entire executive board of directors filed into the massive boardroom in a perfectly organized single-file line. There were 12 of them wearing flawless, bespoke suits and carrying thick leather portfolios. Bradley tried to intercept the lead director, pleading with sheer desperation. "Richard, please tell this crazy old man to leave." But the director completely ignored Bradley, walking right past him as if he were entirely invisible. The entire board of directors moved silently to their designated seats around the massive mahogany table. In perfect unison, all 12 incredibly powerful corporate executives bowed their heads deeply toward the old black man in the faded gardening jacket. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," they chanted together, their voices echoing with absolute total reverence. "Good morning, gentlemen," Jerome replied, nodding respectfully to his loyal board. "Please take your seats." The executive sat down. Jerome reached into his pocket and pulled out Bradley's deactivated executive access key card. He placed the thin plastic card flat on the table and smoothly slid it across the glossy surface until it stopped precisely in front of Bradley. "You are not promoted to Vice President, Bradley," Jerome said, his voice echoing cold and final through the massive room. "You are officially terminated from this company. Pack your pathetic little cardboard box and get the hell out of my building now." The silence in the massive boardroom was deafening following Jerome's shocking declaration. Bradley stood completely frozen, his mind rejecting the reality unfolding right in front of his eyes. He looked frantically at the 12 powerful executives sitting around the long mahogany table, expecting at least one of them to speak up and defend him. But they all just stared back at him with icy, unblinking expressions of total contempt. The sheer humiliation began to curdle into a blinding, uncontrollable rage. Bradley slammed both of his hands down hard on the polished wood surface, his knuckles turning completely white. "You cannot fire me!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "I am a senior director of this company. I have a legally binding employment contract. I have vested stock options that are worth millions of dollars. You cannot just walk in here wearing dirty sweatpants and pretend you have the legal authority to terminate my employment. I will sue you, Jerome. I will sue this entire pathetic company for wrongful termination, and I will completely destroy your public reputation. I will drag your name through the mud until you are begging me to come back." Jerome did not even flinch at the explosive outburst. He simply leaned back in the oversized leather chair, taking another slow, calm sip of his hot black coffee. "You can certainly try to sue me," Bradley Jerome replied, his voice remaining incredibly steady and completely devoid of any emotion. "But you will find that your employment contract contains a very specific morality clause, a clause that you have aggressively and repeatedly violated. Therefore, your precious stock options are void." Bradley felt a cold bead of sweat slowly trace its way down his spine. Panic was officially setting in, but his toxic arrogance refused to let him surrender. He aggressively unclasped his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out his sleek silver laptop, quickly placing it on the table. "You are bluffing," he sneered, opening the computer screen and frantically typing on the keyboard. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Jerome. You think you can just ambush me and take away everything I have worked for. Well, I am not leaving this room until I have my legal team on a conference call. I am going to make you regret the day you ever crossed me." But calling a lawyer was the furthest thing from Bradley's panicked mind. His fingers were flying across the keyboard with desperate, frantic speed. Underneath the table, hidden from the view of the board members, his hands were shaking violently. He was not opening his email application. He was desperately trying to access a hidden encrypted web browser. He knew that if Jerome was truly the founder of Sterling Holdings, the old man would eventually order a massive forensic audit of Bradley's corporate accounts. For the past 3 years, Bradley had been systematically siphoning massive amounts of company money into a series of highly secretive offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. It was his ultimate safety net, his stolen fortune. He desperately needed to wire those hidden funds into a totally untraceable cryptocurrency wallet before Jerome's security team could discover the digital trail. He clicked rapidly through the encrypted security portals, sweating profusely as the loading screens felt agonizingly slow. Come on," he whispered frantically under his breath, totally ignoring the heavy stares of the 12 executives watching him. Every single passing second felt like an eternity. The progress bar on his screen slowly crawled toward 100%. He just needed to execute one final transfer. He typed in his complex master password and aggressively slammed his finger down onto the enter key, feeling a sudden surge of toxic, triumphant relief. He thought he had beaten the old man. He thought he had secured his millions and could now walk out of the building with a stolen fortune. But the screen suddenly flashed a bright, aggressive red color. A massive error message overtook his digital display. Access permanently denied. Funds officially frozen under federal investigation. Bradley stared at the red letters in pure horror. His heart slammed violently against his ribs. He tried to refresh the page, but the entire computer system locked him out, displaying only a solid black screen with a single white padlock icon. He frantically hammered his fists on the keyboard, but the expensive machine was utterly useless. He looked up very slowly, his face drained of all remaining color, feeling like he was suddenly suffocating in the middle of the large open room. Jerome slowly placed his white ceramic coffee mug down on the polished mahogany table, making a sharp, definitive clicking sound. He looked at Bradley with a gaze so heavy and deeply judging that it felt like a physical blow. "We absolutely do not need a thief running our operations," Bradley Jerome said calmly, his deep voice cutting through the thick, heavy silence of the boardroom. "You thought you were so clever hiding your dirty tracks. You thought because I wore gardening clothes and kept to myself that I was blind to what happens inside my own company. You severely underestimated me." Jerome reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a small black plastic remote control. He pointed the device toward the glass ceiling and pressed a single silver button. The heavy mechanical whirring sound of a hidden motor instantly filled the quiet room. Slowly, a massive white projection screen began to descend from the ceiling, smoothly covering the beautiful panoramic view of the city skyline. At the exact same moment, a high-definition digital projector lowered from a hidden compartment directly above the conference table. The bright, glaring light of the projector illuminated the dark room, casting sharp shadows across Bradley's terrified face. The massive white screen flickered to life, displaying a highly detailed, complex financial spreadsheet. Every single row on the digital document highlighted a different illegal wire transfer that Bradley had secretly authorized over the past 3 years. There were dozens and dozens of fake vendor invoices, fabricated consulting fees, and unauthorized bonuses, all directly routed to Bradley's hidden offshore accounts. The dates, the exact dollar amounts, and the destination routing numbers were all perfectly documented and highlighted in bright, glaring yellow ink. The total stolen amount displayed at the very bottom of the massive screen was staggering. It was undeniable, concrete proof of corporate fraud. Bradley stared at the glowing white screen, paralyzed with fear. Every single executive in the room turned to look at the undeniable evidence of his criminal behavior. The meticulous digital trail exposed his toxic greed, leaving him with no room for denial or escape. Bradley stood frozen, his eyes wide and manic as he stared at his own financial execution displayed on the screen. The physical color had drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He looked like a man standing firmly on the trapdoor of a waiting gallows. For a long, terrifying moment, the massive boardroom was silent. The overwhelming weight of the federal crimes hanging over his head was enough to send any normal man falling to his knees begging for mercy. But Bradley Preston was not a normal man. His profound toxic arrogance simply refused to let him die quietly. Slowly, the terrified expression on his pale face began to twist and contort into a sickening, wicked smile. He looked away from the massive projection screen and turned his dark, manic eyes directly toward his father-in-law. He let out a dark, terrifyingly quiet chuckle that slowly grew into a loud, manic laugh. "You really went through a lot of trouble to put this presentation together, old man," Bradley sneered, leaning heavily over the polished mahogany table and staring directly into Jerome's calm, dark eyes. "You really think you have defeated me? You think I am just going to quietly go to a federal prison while your precious daughter lives happily ever after in my beautiful house?" Bradley laughed again, his voice dripping with pure toxic malice. "If I am going down, Jerome, I am taking Maya down to hell with me," he whispered, his wicked smile growing even wider. "I knew the risks of stealing this money, so I made sure to forge Maya's signature on every single one of those shell company and corporation documents. As far as the federal government is concerned, your sweet, innocent daughter is my primary financial accomplice. She is the legally registered owner of the offshore accounts. You call the authorities and you will be sending your own little girl to a federal penitentiary." Bradley crossed his arms over his chest, standing tall, feeling a massive wave of dark, triumphant power. He stared at the old man, convinced that he had just played the ultimate winning card. He believed with every single twisted fiber of his dark, toxic soul that he finally had the great Jerome Sterling permanently trapped and completely cornered exactly where he wanted him. The tension in the massive executive boardroom had reached an absolute boiling point. Bradley Preston stood at the edge of the polished mahogany table, staring at the undeniable evidence of his monumental financial crimes glowing brightly on the massive projector screen. He had just threatened to drag his own wife into a federal prison. But Jerome did not move a single muscle. Jerome simply sat in the oversized leather executive chair, his dark eyes completely calm and utterly devoid of fear. The 12 powerful board members remained perfectly silent, watching the pathetic desperation of a ruined man. He was locked out of his corporate accounts, and he was currently standing in a room full of powerful witnesses who had just heard him confess to federal wire fraud and systemic financial embezzlement. Bradley was backed into a very dark corner, but his deeply ingrained toxic privilege refused to let him surrender gracefully. If he could not win the financial battle, he was going to weaponize the ultimate tool of oppression. He reached into his expensive tailored suit jacket and pulled out his sleek new smartphone. His hands were still trembling violently, but a vicious smile spread across his pale, sweaty face. He looked directly at Jerome, his eyes burning with pure, toxic malice and intense racial hatred. "You really think you have everything under control, old man?" Bradley sneered, taking a step backward toward the heavy mahogany doors. "You think because you own this massive building that you are completely untouchable. You seem to forget exactly who I am and exactly how the real world works. People like you do not get to win against people like me. I am going to show you exactly what happens when an arrogant old black man threatens a wealthy white corporate executive." Bradley aggressively tapped the screen of his phone and dialed the emergency services number. He pressed the phone tightly against his ear, keeping his dark, manic eyes locked dead onto Jerome. When the emergency dispatcher finally answered the call, Bradley's entire demeanor instantly transformed. The vicious, arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of pure, fabricated terror. His voice suddenly became incredibly shaky and deeply panicked, perfectly playing the role of a helpless victim in mortal danger. "Yes, hello, please. I need immediate police assistance at the Sterling Holdings corporate headquarters," Bradley cried into the phone, his voice cracking with artificial fear. "I am a senior executive director here, and I am currently trapped in the main boardroom on the 50th floor. There is an incredibly aggressive black man trespassing in our secure facility. He has forced his way into a private executive meeting, and he is physically threatening my life. Please, you have to send officers right now before he hurts someone." Bradley paused, listening to the emergency dispatcher asking for more specific details. He nodded his head, acting completely frantic and deeply terrified. "Yes, he is a large, older black man wearing dirty street clothes, and he is acting completely erratic and violently unstable." Bradley lied, smoothly injecting a heavy dose of calculated racial bias into his urgent plea. "He is refusing to let anyone leave the room. He says he owns the building and he is threatening to completely destroy my life. I think he might be armed. Please hurry. I am terrified for my absolute safety and the safety of my entire board of directors." Bradley slowly lowered the phone and ended the emergency call. The fabricated fear immediately melted away from his face, completely replaced by a sickening, arrogant grin. "They are sending heavily armed officers right now," Jerome Bradley whispered, his voice dripping with pure, toxic confidence. "In less than 5 minutes, a tactical police unit is going to storm through those heavy doors. They are not going to ask you politely for your corporate credentials. They are not going to care that you secretly founded this company. When they walk into this room, they are only going to see exactly what society has carefully trained them to see. They will see a wealthy, highly respected white executive in a designer suit begging for his life. And they will see a poor, angry black man in dirty sweatpants causing a violent disturbance. You will be violently handcuffed and dragged out in complete disgrace. And once you are locked in a jail cell, I will easily convince my lawyers that you fabricated this entire financial presentation as a crazy act of revenge." Bradley laughed loudly, a hollow, echoing sound that filled the tense boardroom. "You played a decent game, old man, but you simply do not understand the absolute power of privilege. I will always win." The heavy wailing sound of approaching police sirens suddenly pierced the thick glass windows of the 50th floor. Bradley smiled a wicked, victorious smile, adjusting his expensive silk tie. The loud, chaotic sounds of heavy combat boots pounding rapidly down the hallway echoed through the silent corporate building. Without any warning, the massive mahogany doors to the executive boardroom were violently kicked open. A heavily armed tactical police unit swarmed directly into the room, their weapons drawn and ready. Bradley instantly dropped to his knees, throwing both of his hands high into the air. He squeezed his eyes tightly shut and forced a loud, dramatic sob to escape his throat. "Thank God you are finally here," Bradley cried out, his voice trembling with award-winning fake terror. "Please help me. He is completely unhinged. He has been holding us hostage and threatening to hurt everyone in this room." 4 officers immediately rushed past the kneeling executive, their intense focus entirely locked onto Jerome Sterling. Jerome did not flinch or raise his voice. He slowly placed his calloused hands flat onto the polished wooden table, remaining perfectly seated in the oversized leather chair. 2 young officers approached him rapidly, unhooking heavy metal handcuffs from their tactical belts. "Sir, keep your hands exactly where we can see them," the lead officer commanded loudly, stepping up to the head of the massive table. Bradley kept his head bowed, but he peeked through his fingers, watching the scene unfold with absolute delight. His twisted plan was working flawlessly. The police were treating the billionaire founder of the company exactly like a common violent criminal simply because of the faded clothes he wore and the dark color of his skin. The officers reached for Jerome's arms, preparing to pull him forcefully out of his chair. The entire board of directors sat perfectly still, watching the intense interaction without speaking a single word. They knew better than to interrupt what was about to happen next. Bradley smiled, anticipating the sweet sound of metal handcuffs clicking tightly shut around his father-in-law's wrists. He eagerly waited for the ultimate humiliation of the man who had dared to cross him. He wanted to carefully savor every single agonizing second of this glorious triumph because he genuinely believed that his immense corporate status made him completely and utterly invincible against any possible consequence in this entire unpredictable world. Before the young officer could even secure the metal handcuffs around Jerome's wrists, a sharp, booming voice echoed from the back of the massive boardroom. "Stand down immediately," the authoritative voice commanded. The tactical officers instantly froze, stepping back to clear a path. The chief of police walked slowly into the room. He was an older, highly decorated veteran who knew exactly who truly ran the city. The chief walked directly past the kneeling Bradley, completely ignoring his dramatic fake sobbing. When the chief reached the head of the table, he immediately removed his uniform hat and bowed his head with profound, deep respect. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," the chief said politely, his tone incredibly gentle. "Is this man currently bothering you, sir?" Bradley stopped crying instantly. His entire world suddenly stopped spinning. He slowly lowered his hands, staring at the police chief in total, absolute disbelief. Jerome calmly picked up his coffee mug and took a slow sip. "He is just leaving," Chief Jerome replied softly. The police chief nodded respectfully and turned around to face Bradley. The polite demeanor instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened glare. The chief reached into his dark uniform jacket, pulling out a folded white document bearing an official federal seal. Bradley Preston, the chief, announced, his voice booming loudly across the completely silent boardroom. "You are officially under arrest for systemic federal wire fraud and felony domestic battery." 2 tactical officers immediately grabbed Bradley by his expensive suit jacket, dragging him violently up from the floor. The cold, heavy metal handcuffs that were meant for Jerome were swiftly and painfully clamped tightly around Bradley's pale, trembling wrists. Bradley wept openly, completely humiliated in front of the entire executive office, as his toxic empire finally burned directly down to the cold, dark ground. The house was completely quiet after my father left with Susan and the towed cars. I stood in my master bedroom, staring at the half-packed duffel bag sitting on the bed. My cheeks still throbbed from where Bradley struck me, but a profound sense of peace was slowly starting to wash over my entire body. I was finally leaving this incredibly toxic prison. I methodically pulled my favorite sweaters from the mahogany dresser drawers and stacked them neatly into the bag. I left behind every piece of expensive jewelry Bradley had ever purchased for me. I wanted nothing to do with his dirty money or his suffocating control. I zipped up the heavy bag, feeling a massive weight lift directly off my shoulders. I was just about to carry the luggage downstairs when a loud and extremely aggressive pounding echoed through the silent house. It was a violently rhythmic hammering against the heavy front door. I froze in my tracks, my heart suddenly racing. For a terrifying second, I thought Bradley had somehow managed to escape his corporate office and come back home to punish me. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, and walked slowly down the curved wooden staircase. The aggressive pounding continued, growing even louder and more frantic. I approached the frosted glass of the front door and peered outside. It was not Bradley. Standing on the front porch was a young, beautiful blonde woman who looked to be in her early 20s. She was wearing a tight pink designer tracksuit and carrying a massive, expensive leather handbag. Her face was flushed bright red with extreme anger, and she was aggressively slamming her perfectly manicured fist against the solid oak wood. I slowly unlocked the heavy deadbolt and opened the door just a few inches. Before I could even speak a single word of greeting, the young woman pushed violently past me, forcing her way directly into the grand foyer. "Where is Bradley?" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing loudly off the high vaulted ceilings. "I need to see him right now, this instant." I stumbled backward, completely taken aback by her intense hostility and sheer audacity. I smoothed my simple cotton shirt and looked at her with pure confusion. "Bradley is not here," I replied, my voice completely steady. "He is currently at his corporate office. Who are you, and why are you forcing your way into my private home?" The young blonde woman aggressively crossed her arms over her chest, letting out a loud, harsh, mocking laugh. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, toxic disgust. "Oh, you must be the pathetic little wife," she sneered, rolling her bright blue eyes. "My name is Chloe, and I am here because your stupid husband just completely humiliated me at the luxury baby boutique downtown." I stared at her, trying to process her chaotic words. "Baby boutique," I repeated, feeling a sudden cold chill run directly down my spine. Chloe dramatically placed her manicured hand directly over her slightly rounded stomach, a wicked, arrogant smile spreading across her young face. "Yes, Maya, I am pregnant with Bradley's child," she announced proudly, her voice dripping with pure toxic malice. "He promised me he was going to leave you months ago. He said you were just a miserable, boring burden holding him back from living his best life. He set me up in a gorgeous luxury apartment across town and gave me a platinum corporate credit card to buy whatever I wanted for our new baby. But when I went to purchase a $10,000 custom crib this morning, the stupid card was completely declined. I tried to use his secondary executive card, and that one was denied too. He is completely ignoring all of my phone calls, and I am absolutely furious." She took a heavy step toward me, her face contorting with arrogant entitlement. "You need to call him right now and tell him to fix this financial mess," she demanded loudly. "I am carrying the true heir to his massive corporate fortune, and I will not be embarrassed by declined credit cards in public." I stood completely frozen in the grand foyer, staring at the young pregnant woman standing in my house. The sheer magnitude of Bradley's betrayal hit me like a massive physical blow. He had not only been stealing millions of dollars from my father's company and physically abusing me, but he had also been funding a secret double life with a young mistress. The pain in my chest was incredibly sharp and deeply suffocating. I had spent years desperately trying to be the perfect submissive wife to a man who secretly hated me and casually replaced me. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the hot, stinging tears welling up in the corners of my eyes. Chloe noticed the tears forming, and she let out another loud, cruel laugh. She reached into her expensive pink handbag and aggressively pulled out her new smartphone. "You do not believe me, do you?" she asked, her voice mocking and incredibly cold. "You actually think he loves you. You think he cares about you or your stupid family. Let me play something for you, Maya. Let me show you exactly what Bradley truly thinks about his pathetic little wife." She aggressively tapped the screen of her phone and turned the volume all the way up to the maximum level. A familiar, deep voice instantly echoed through the grand foyer. It was Bradley's voice, sounding completely relaxed, and incredibly cruel. "I hate going back to that house, Chloe," the recorded voice of my husband complained bitterly. "Maya is so incredibly stupid and entirely useless. She just sits around looking sad all day. I only married her because she is weak and remarkably easy to control. I need a woman I can mold perfectly to my liking. The second my massive promotion comes through, I am kicking her out on the street with absolutely nothing. You are the only woman I truly love, baby." The audio message abruptly ended, making a sharp clicking sound in the quiet hallway. Chloe smiled a deeply wicked and entirely victorious smile. "See," she sneered, putting her phone back into her expensive bag. "He despises you, Maya. You are nothing but a convenient little pawn in his successful life. Now pick up your phone and call him so he can fix my credit cards before I lose my mind." For a brief, agonizing moment, I felt completely and utterly crushed. My entire marriage had been a carefully constructed illusion, built entirely on calculated manipulation and profound emotional abuse. The man I had loved and trusted was nothing more than a heartless, toxic monster who viewed me as completely disposable. I felt my knees suddenly go incredibly weak, and my breathing became rapid and shallow. But then I vividly remembered the sharp burning slap across my face from the previous night. I remembered my father's calm, steady eyes in the kitchen, and suddenly the paralyzing grief inside my chest completely evaporated, replaced by an icy, completely unshakable rage. I was no longer the weak, frightened girl Bradley thought he could easily control. The tears instantly dried, and my entire demeanor turned incredibly cold and fiercely powerful. I looked directly into Chloe's arrogant blue eyes, feeling absolutely no pity for her whatsoever. I did not say a word to the demanding young woman. I turned around and walked purposefully down the long hallway toward Bradley's private home office. Chloe followed closely behind me, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the polished floor. "What are you doing?" she yelled, sounding annoyed. "I told you to call him immediately." I stepped into the dark oak-paneled office and walked directly toward the massive oil painting hanging securely on the far wall. I reached up and smoothly pulled the heavy frame to the side, revealing a modern digital wall safe hidden perfectly within the drywall. Bradley had repeatedly told me that the safe was for highly classified corporate documents and forbade me from ever going near it. He always assumed I was too simple and unobservant to figure out his private numeric password. But I had watched him carefully type the numbers multiple times in the reflection of the glass window. I aggressively punched the 6-digit code into the digital keypad. The heavy metal door clicked loudly and swung completely open. Inside the dark safe sat stacks of crisp $100 bills and a small silver hard drive. I completely ignored the cash and grabbed the silver hard drive, gripping it very tightly in my hand. I turned slowly back around to face the young pregnant mistress standing entirely confused in the doorway. "You honestly think he is a rich man?" I asked, my voice echoing cold and completely dead. "He is broke, Chloe, and after I give this drive to the FBI, he will be in federal prison." The heavy iron gates of my private estate stood tall and imposing against the bright afternoon sky. I had lived in this secluded property for over 15 years, choosing to keep my true wealth completely hidden from the outside world. The sprawling grounds were completely surrounded by thick stone walls and a dense forest of ancient oak trees. Nobody in Bradley's arrogant family had ever bothered to ask where I actually lived, because they simply assumed I rented a small, run-down apartment in a bad neighborhood. Today, however, the illusion was completely shattered. The high-definition security cameras mounted on the front gates buzzed softly as a sleek silver luxury sedan pulled up aggressively to the intercom speaker. I watched the live video feed from the monitor on my porch. Richard and Susan Preston, my highly privileged and incredibly toxic in-laws, stepped out of their expensive vehicle. They looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant elitist snobs who had relentlessly mocked my daughter and my heritage. The crisp white linen suit Susan had worn just a few days ago was completely gone, replaced by a wrinkled dark dress. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was messy, and her expensive makeup was visibly running down her face. Richard looked even worse. His face was pale and covered in a thick layer of nervous sweat. His expensive silk tie hung loosely around his neck, and his hands were shaking violently. They approached the heavy iron gates, looking completely desperate and entirely pathetic. I pressed the silver button on my remote control, allowing the massive iron gates to swing open slowly. They practically ran up the long, winding cobblestone driveway, their expensive leather shoes struggling against the uneven terrain. By the time they reached the large wraparound porch of my main house, they were both breathing heavily and sweating profusely. They stopped dead in their tracks, staring in absolute shock at the massive multi-million-dollar mansion that stood before them, the pristine, white columns, the grand wraparound porch, and the perfectly manicured gardens completely destroyed their toxic narrative of my poverty. I was standing quietly on the front steps waiting for them. Susan immediately burst into tears the second she saw me. It was not genuine sorrow. It was the calculated, highly dramatic sobbing of a privileged woman who was finally facing severe consequences for the very first time in her entire miserable life. She threw herself forward, stopping just at the bottom of the wooden steps, and clasped her hands together in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Jerome, please," she cried, her voice cracking with artificial agony. "You have to help us. You have to tell the federal police that this is all a massive misunderstanding. Bradley is currently sitting in a cold, dark federal holding cell, and they are refusing to grant him bail. They are treating my precious boy like a common violent criminal." Richard stepped forward, standing nervously next to his sobbing wife. He wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead with a wrinkled silk handkerchief. "Jerome, please listen to reason." Richard begged, his voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant authority. "We know Bradley made some foolish mistakes at the company. We acknowledge that he crossed the line, but he is a good man. Deep down, he is the father of your beautiful grandchildren. You cannot simply let them send him to a federal penitentiary. It will completely ruin his life and destroy our family name forever. If you just drop the criminal charges and withdraw the corporate fraud complaint, we will make sure he repays every single penny he took from your company. We will force him to go to marriage counseling with Maya. Just please call your powerful lawyers and make all of this go away." I looked down at the two pathetic figures standing on my property. Just yesterday, this exact same woman had marched directly into my daughter's bedroom, violently grabbed her arm and threatened to take her children away. Just yesterday, this exact same man was using his powerful social connections to threaten my family. They had spent years treating my beautiful daughter like dirt and looking down on my African American heritage with complete and utter disgust. Now that their stolen corporate empire was crumbling to the ground, they were standing in my driveway begging for mercy. They did not care about Maya. They did not care about the physical abuse Bradley had inflicted on my child. They only cared about protecting their toxic golden child and preserving their fake upper-class reputation. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for either of them. I simply stared at them, letting their desperate fake tears fall on completely deaf ears. While they hopelessly wept and loudly begged for my immediate forgiveness, I slowly turned away from their pathetic weeping and walked calmly toward the large garden bed near the porch. I picked up a heavy green watering can. My prize-winning red roses were in full bloom. I tilted the heavy metal spout carefully, pouring a steady, gentle stream of water over the dark, rich soil, entirely ignoring the two ruined people standing behind me. "You know, Richard," I said softly, keeping my steady gaze fixed entirely on my beautiful, healthy flowers, "a garden requires a tremendous amount of extremely hard work and intense daily discipline to thrive properly. If you simply ignore the early subtle signs of decay, or if you blindly allow the toxic parasites to grow unchecked, the entire beautiful garden will eventually die completely." I slowly set the heavy green watering can down onto the smooth gray stone path and finally turned around to face my panicked in-laws. "You two are standing here begging me to save your precious son from the completely natural consequences of his own terrible actions." I continued, my voice remaining incredibly calm, but carrying a deeply chilling underlying weight. "But you do not truly understand the massive monster you have successfully created. You spent his entire privileged life fiercely protecting him from every single minor failure. You constantly taught him that he was vastly superior to everyone else simply because of his skin color and the massive amount of money sitting in your bank accounts. You actively encouraged his extreme arrogance, and you blindly applauded his deep cruelties. And when he brought my sweet, innocent daughter into your toxic family, you completely allowed him to deeply emotionally abuse her while you stood by and proudly cheered him on. I took a slow, deliberate step toward them, pointing a calloused finger directly at Richard's pale, sweating face. "Your son is a poisonous weed," I declared firmly. "He is a deeply destructive force that slowly suffocates everything good and beautiful around him. And as an experienced gardener, I know exactly what you absolutely must do when you finally discover a highly toxic weed growing inside your beautiful yard. You do not negotiate with it. You do not offer it another chance to ruin your healthy soil. You reach down deep into the dirt and you violently pull it completely out by its very root, so it can never grow back and hurt anyone." Susan let out a horrifying, high-pitched wail, clutching her chest, as if she had just been physically shot by a massive, heavy bullet. Richard simply stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, completely unable to form a single coherent word. They finally understood that there would be absolutely no mercy given today. Their precious son was going to face the full terrifying wrath of the federal justice system, and there was nothing their fake upper-class privilege could do to stop it. I reached into the deep inside pocket of my tailored jacket and slowly pulled out a thick manila folder. I held the heavy document out toward Richard. His trembling hands hesitated for a brief, terrifying moment before he finally reached out and took the folder from my firm grasp. He slowly opened the thick cover and stared down at the crisp white legal papers inside his pale eyes, frantically scanned the heavily typed paragraphs, his breathing growing extremely shallow and incredibly rapid. "What in the world is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling violently as the dark, terrifying reality slowly washed over his ruined mind. "I bought the private bank that holds your massive estate mortgage." "Richard," I stated calmly, crossing my arms over my chest, "I already know about your incredibly dark and dirty little secret. I know you and Susan have been secretly drowning in massive financial debt for years, desperately using all Bradley's stolen corporate money to aggressively fund your fake, luxurious lifestyle. You are currently 6 months behind on your heavy payments. You have exactly 30 days to completely vacate your sprawling estate before my legal team officially seizes the entire property and throws all of your expensive designer belongings directly onto the cold, dirty public street forever." The cold, damp air of the county jail had completely seeped into Bradley's bones during his 72-hour stay. He was entirely stripped of his expensive designer suits and forced to wear a bright orange jumpsuit that smelled strongly of harsh industrial bleach and lingering despair. When the heavy steel doors finally buzzed open and the weary guard handed him his personal belongings, Bradley felt a sudden, intense rush of desperate relief. However, that brief relief was immediately crushed by the terrifying reality of his current situation. His corporate accounts were permanently frozen. His massive luxury estate had been officially seized. His toxic parents were entirely bankrupt and completely unreachable. The only reason he was currently walking out of the heavily guarded federal detention center was because he had made a very dark and incredibly dangerous desperate deal. Waiting for him in the dimly lit parking lot was a heavily tinted black luxury SUV. Inside the vehicle sat 2 extremely dangerous men who operated far outside the boundaries of the traditional legal system. Bradley had essentially sold his soul to a violent underground lending syndicate to secure the $200,000 in cash needed for his emergency bail. The loan sharks did not care about his former corporate title or his ruined public reputation. They only cared about their massive, exorbitant interest rates, and they had explicitly promised to break his legs if he failed to repay the massive debt within 30 days. Bradley slid nervously into the back seat of the dark vehicle, sweating profusely, as the large, threatening men stared at him in complete, chilling silence. He knew he was completely out of time and out of options, but his toxic arrogance simply refused to let him die quietly. He desperately needed a massive influx of cash, and he knew exactly where to get it. He was legally married to the sole heiress of a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire. He directed the silent driver to take him straight to the towering glass and steel office building of the most ruthless and wildly expensive family law attorney in the entire city. The lawyer was a notorious legal shark named Victor Thorne, who specialized exclusively in deeply vicious, high-net-worth divorce settlements. Victor was famous for completely destroying families and extracting massive multi-million-dollar payouts for his wealthy elite clients. Bradley marched directly into the luxurious penthouse law office, completely ignoring the deeply concerned looks from the reception staff regarding his rumpled, dirty clothes and his frantic, manic energy. He practically kicked open the door to Victor's private office, throwing himself heavily into the plush leather chair opposite the massive mahogany desk. "I need your services immediately," Victor Bradley demanded, his voice cracking with pure, desperate aggression. "My father-in-law just orchestrated a massive illegal corporate coup and completely froze all of my personal assets. My wife is aggressively filing for a hostile divorce and trying to completely cut me out of the massive family fortune. I need you to file an emergency injunction right now, this very second. I want full, absolute custody of my 2 children, and I am demanding exactly 50% of every single asset the Sterling family currently owns." Victor slowly put down his expensive silver fountain pen and looked at Bradley with a cold, deeply calculating stare. He steepled his fingers together, resting his chin gently on his hands. "You look absolutely terrible, Bradley," Victor stated calmly, completely unfazed by the frantic, chaotic energy radiating from the ruined executive sitting across from him. "I have seen the terrible news articles circulating this morning. The federal government is aggressively pursuing massive wire fraud charges against you. You are facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Fighting a billionaire family in a vicious divorce court requires a tremendous amount of liquid capital. I require a massive $50,000 retainer fee paid up front before I even look at a single piece of your paperwork." Bradley frantically pulled a thick stack of dirty $100 bills from his coat pocket, slamming the money aggressively onto the pristine, polished desk. It was the absolute last bit of cash he had borrowed from the dangerous men in the dark SUV. "Take it," Bradley hissed, his dark eyes wide and completely manic. "Take every single penny. I do not care what dirty legal tricks you have to pull or who you have to completely destroy in the process. Maya is the sole beneficiary of Sterling Holdings. If I secure full custody of those kids and demand 50% of her marital assets, we are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. You get me that massive settlement, and I will personally pay you a $5 million bonus the exact second the ink dries on the final court documents. Just completely destroy her, Victor. Leave her and that arrogant old man with absolutely nothing." Victor calmly picked up the thick stacks of dirty cash and neatly placed them into his heavy desk drawer. He then reached out and took the messy, crumpled file folder that Bradley had aggressively thrown onto the desk. The folder contained all of Bradley's personal financial records, copies of the children's birth certificates, and the original legal copies of his marriage documents. Bradley leaned back in the plush leather chair, his dark, manic energy slowly transforming back into his typical, deeply toxic arrogance. He wiped the cold sweat from his pale forehead and smiled a deeply wicked, victorious smile. "I am going to absolutely ruin that pathetic woman," Bradley gloated, his voice dripping with pure, malicious joy. "She genuinely thought she could just pack a cheap little bag and walk completely away from me. She thought her powerful daddy could just snap his fingers and erase my entire existence. But they are both incredibly stupid. We have been legally married for 10 long years, Victor. We live in a state with extremely strict community property laws. Every single dollar that old man secretly funneled into her personal trust accounts during our long marriage legally belongs to me just as much as it belongs to her. I am going to legally drain their massive accounts until they are begging me for mercy on their pathetic knees." Victor did not respond to Bradley's toxic, arrogant rant. He simply placed a pair of thin silver reading glasses over his sharp eyes and began meticulously reviewing the crumpled stack of official documents. The quiet ticking of the expensive grandfather clock in the corner of the room echoed loudly in the tense, heavy silence. Bradley continued to gloat, pacing his breathing and imagining the sweet taste of total ultimate revenge. He pictured the look of sheer utter terror on Maya's face when she realized she was going to completely lose her precious children and half of her entire family fortune. He visualized himself using the massive divorce settlement to easily pay off the dangerous underground loan sharks and subsequently fleeing the country to live like a billionaire king on some beautiful tropical island, entirely free from federal prosecution and completely untouched by any earthly consequences. He felt completely invincible again. The brilliant legal strategy was absolutely flawless in his arrogant mind. Victor slowly turned the page of the thick legal file and stopped abruptly. The highly seasoned attorney stared intently at a specific piece of paper near the very bottom of the stack. His sharp brow furrowed in deep confusion and then slowly relaxed into an expression of pure absolute disbelief. He read the single document over again, tracing the printed lines with his perfectly manicured finger, shaking his head slightly side to side. The tense silence in the room suddenly shifted from quiet anticipation to something incredibly heavy and deeply ominous. Bradley noticed the sudden dramatic change in the lawyer's demeanor and nervously leaned forward, gripping the padded arms of his expensive leather chair. "What is it?" Victor Bradley asked, his voice suddenly losing its confident, arrogant edge. "Did you find the community property clauses we need to completely bankrupt them? Please tell me you have found the exact legal loophole we desperately need to destroy her entire life right now." Victor slowly removed his silver reading glasses and let them drop onto the desk with a sharp clatter. He picked up the official marriage document and casually dropped the heavy file back onto the polished mahogany wood. The brilliant lawyer leaned incredibly far forward, resting his heavy elbows solidly on the massive, expensive desktop and staring deep into the panicked soul of his completely ruined client. He looked directly at Bradley with an expression of profound professional disgust and complete sheer pity, sighing very heavily before speaking. "You idiot," Victor said, his voice suddenly sounding incredibly cold and utterly merciless. "To avoid federal taxes 3 years ago, you forged the marriage certificate renewal incorrectly. You are not legally married. You have no right to a single dime of her family money." Bradley stormed out of the luxurious penthouse law office, feeling a profound mixture of absolute rage and terrifying vulnerability. The devastating revelation from the ruthless divorce attorney had completely shattered his brilliant master plan. He was not legally married to Maya. He had absolutely no legal right to demand a single penny of her massive family fortune. His grand vision of extorting the Sterling family for hundreds of millions of dollars had evaporated into thin air, leaving him completely exposed to the incoming federal criminal charges. But his highly toxic arrogance simply refused to accept total defeat. If he could not completely destroy Maya in a prestigious family court, he would absolutely destroy her in the unforgiving court of public opinion. He still possessed his expensive smartphone, and he still had the direct contact information for some of the most ruthless tabloid journalists in the entire city. He frantically hailed a cheap taxicab and directed the driver to a notoriously sleazy media agency located in the dirty industrial district of the city. The digital gossip outlet was incredibly famous for publishing completely unverified rumors, destroying personal reputations, and feeding highly toxic scandals to millions of eager readers every single day. Bradley walked aggressively into the crowded, messy newsroom, his orange jail jumpsuit now replaced by a cheap wrinkled suit he had borrowed from his ruined father. He demanded an immediate private meeting with the senior editor-in-chief, a slimy, opportunistic man named Greg, who cared absolutely nothing about journalistic integrity and only cared about massive internet traffic. Bradley threw himself into the cheap plastic chair across from Greg's cluttered metal desk, leaning forward with a dark, manic energy. "I have the ultimate exclusive story for you, Greg," Bradley whispered, his voice dripping with pure, calculated malice. "I am a senior executive director at Sterling Holdings, and I have an explosive inside. Story about the billionaire heiress Maya Sterling." Greg instantly leaned forward, his greedy eyes lighting up with intense predatory interest. Bradley spent the next 2 hours weaving a completely fabricated and deeply toxic narrative. He painted himself as the innocent, hardworking victim who was trapped in a highly abusive relationship with a completely unhinged and dangerously violent woman. He boldly lied and claimed that Maya suffered from severe undiagnosed mental illnesses and that she regularly physically attacked him in fits of extreme paranoid rage. He completely twisted the events of the Sunday barbecue, claiming that her elderly father, Jerome, was a violent criminal who had brutally assaulted him, unprovoked, simply because Bradley had tried to protect himself from Maya's crazy, violent outbursts. To make the massive lie seem completely credible, Bradley aggressively showed Greg the dark purple bruises on his arms and legs that he had actually received from the dangerous underground loan sharks the previous night. He completely flipped the entire narrative, turning his own horrific domestic abuse and financial crimes into a tragic story of his own victimhood. He explicitly detailed fake accounts of Maya throwing heavy glass bottles at him, destroying his expensive personal property, and relentlessly verbally abusing him behind closed doors. He even claimed that the recent federal police raid at his corporate office was a completely illegal setup, orchestrated by her incredibly wealthy and highly corrupt father to silence him before he could file for divorce. "This story is going to absolutely break the internet," Greg said, his greedy smile stretching widely across his pale face. "We will run it as our top-breaking news headline tonight. It will completely ruin her social reputation forever." Bradley smiled, a deeply wicked and entirely victorious smile. He genuinely believed that by completely destroying Maya's public image, he could somehow force the Sterling family to drop the federal fraud charges and quietly settle with him outside of court, just to make the massive, humiliating scandal disappear. He walked out of the dirty tabloid office feeling a massive wave of dark, triumphant power, completely convinced that his brilliant manipulation had successfully checkmated the old man. He stood on the busy sidewalk, breathing in the heavily polluted city air and feeling entirely untouchable. Once again, the desperate anxiety that had plagued him all morning was now completely replaced by a profound sense of toxic euphoria. He eagerly pulled out his phone and constantly refreshed the dirty gossip website, waiting for the exact moment his vicious lies would be published for the entire world to see. He wanted to watch the glorious destruction of the woman he had vowed to deeply protect. He imagined her crying hysterically as her perfect, pristine reputation was brutally dragged through the disgusting mud by millions of angry internet strangers. It was the absolute perfect revenge strategy for a remarkably cruel man who had absolutely nothing left to lose in life. At exactly 6 o'clock that evening, the massive defamatory article officially went live across multiple digital platforms. Maya was sitting quietly in the warm, comfortable living room of her father's sprawling, secure estate, gently helping her 2 young children with their evening reading assignments. Suddenly, her smartphone began to vibrate violently against the solid wooden coffee table. It buzzed repeatedly in a chaotic, relentless rhythm. She slowly picked up the device and saw dozens of rapid text messages aggressively flooding her locked screen. Friends, distant relatives, and former co-workers were all frantically sending her the exact same digital web link. She hesitantly tapped the glowing blue link, and her heart instantly dropped violently into her stomach. The bold, glaring headline practically screamed off the bright digital screen. "Billionaire heiress Maya Sterling, exposed as violent, abusive monster to her innocent executive husband." Below the horrifying title was a highly edited photograph of Bradley looking incredibly sad and pathetic, alongside an awful, deeply unflattering picture of Maya. Maya began to read the completely fabricated paragraphs, her hands shaking with profound terror. Every single sentence was a vicious, disgusting lie carefully designed to entirely destroy her character. She felt the hot, stinging tears welling up in her eyes. The sheer injustice of the cruel situation was completely overwhelming. He was the abusive monster, but he was currently convincing the entire world that she was the toxic villain. "Dad," she cried out, her voice breaking with intense emotional distress. "He posted a completely fake story about me online. People are leaving horrible, aggressive comments calling me a criminal. Jerome calmly walked into the living room, holding his old flip phone. He did not look surprised or angry. He simply walked over to his terrified daughter and gently placed his warm, calloused hand directly onto her trembling shoulder. "Do not shed a single tear over the desperate actions of a dying snake." Jerome said, his deep voice radiating complete, peaceful authority. "Let him have his brief moment of fake victory. I want you to sit right here, wipe your beautiful face, and wait exactly 10 minutes. Not 9 minutes and not 11 minutes. Just wait exactly 10 minutes. Maya took a very deep, shaky breath, looking up at her incredibly calm, powerful father. She slowly wiped the tears from her eyes and stared directly at the ticking clock on the wall, quietly counting the seconds. Bradley was sitting in a cheap, dark motel room, drinking from a dirty glass and loudly celebrating his toxic public victory. He constantly refreshed the web page on his phone, grinning wickedly as the hateful comments against Maya quickly multiplied into the thousands. But exactly 10 minutes after the article was officially published, his phone screen suddenly went completely blank. He frantically hit the refresh button again. The vicious article about Maya had entirely vanished. It was not just deleted, it was completely scrubbed from the entire internet. In its exact place, a massive new headline suddenly appeared across the front page of the digital site. Sterling Holdings executive Bradley Preston, arrested for massive corporate embezzlement and felony domestic abuse. Directly beneath the explosive new headline was his official humiliating police mugshot, prominently displayed for the entire world to clearly see. Bradley dropped his cheap glass, shattering it violently across the dirty motel floor. His phone instantly began to ring, displaying an unknown private number. He answered the call, his hands shaking with absolute terror. "What did you do to the website?" he screamed into the receiver, his voice breaking with pure frantic panic. Jerome's incredibly calm, deep voice echoed smoothly through the small device. "You truly thought a sleazy tabloid editor could protect you from my reach?" Jerome asked, sounding entirely bored. "I just purchased the entire massive media conglomerate that owns that pathetic digital website. Bradley Gregg, the slimy editor you bribed, was just officially fired 10 seconds ago. Your vicious lies are gone, your reputation is completely destroyed, and your dark criminal truth is now the top trending global news story. Checkmate, little boy." The phone line went completely dead, leaving Bradley entirely alone in the terrifying silent darkness, his toxic empire permanently reduced to absolute ashes. The complete destruction of his public reputation and the total failure of his media smear campaign left Bradley Preston entirely unhinged. His brilliant plans were rapidly crumbling into dust, leaving him absolutely desperate and incredibly dangerous. He was currently hiding in a cheap, filthy motel room, staring blindly at the peeling wallpaper. His mind was racing with dark, chaotic thoughts. He had no money, no legal leverage, and no powerful allies. But he still had one final twisted card left to play in his toxic, desperate game. He realized that Jerome Sterling loved his grandchildren more than anything else in the entire world. Bradley decided that if he could physically take the children, he could use them as the ultimate bargaining chips. He would hold them ransom, demanding millions of dollars and complete legal immunity in exchange for their safe return. It was a profoundly sick and twisted plan, but his toxic arrogance convinced him it was his absolute right as their biological father. He quickly left the dark motel room and stole a completely unlocked running vehicle from the nearby gas station, driving recklessly toward the elite private academy his children attended. The prestigious elementary school was nestled in a highly affluent suburban neighborhood completely surrounded by lush green trees and expensive security gates. Bradley violently parked the stolen car directly in the fire lane right outside the main glass doors. He marched aggressively toward the building, his wrinkled clothes and deeply manic eyes making him look like a complete madman. He pushed open the heavy glass doors and stormed directly into the quiet, pristine reception area. The elegant front desk was currently managed by a sweet older woman named Eleanor, who immediately looked up with a polite but highly cautious smile. "Good afternoon, sir," she said softly. "How may I help you today?" Bradley did not even bother to slow his aggressive pace. He slammed both of his hands violently down onto her polished wooden desk, completely startling the poor woman. "I am Bradley Preston," he barked loudly, his voice echoing sharply through the quiet, pristine lobby. "I am here to pick up my 2 children immediately. Call their classrooms right now and tell them their father is taking them home for a family emergency." Eleanor nervously adjusted her glasses, her hands trembling slightly as she quickly typed his name into the secure school database. She looked back up at him, her expression filled with deep confusion and growing fear. "I am very sorry, Mr. Preston, but you are not currently listed on the approved emergency pickup list for today," she explained, her voice shaking slightly. "Only their mother Maya or their grandfather Jerome are legally authorized to sign them out of the building this afternoon." Bradley felt a massive wave of blinding, toxic rage violently wash over his entire body. He leaned aggressively over the polished wooden desk, his dark, manic eyes glaring directly into her terrified face. "You listen to me, you pathetic, incompetent woman," he hissed, his voice dripping with pure toxic malice. "I am their biological father. I pay the massive tuition bills that keep this stupid school running, and I do not need your stupid permission or some pathetic authorized list to take my own children. You will call their classrooms right now, or I will personally walk down that hallway and physically drag them out myself." Eleanor completely froze her face, turning pale with absolute terror. She slowly reached her trembling hand toward the silent panic button hidden carefully underneath her wooden desk. But Bradley did not wait for her to press the button. He violently pushed himself away from the desk. Bradley aggressively marched directly toward the secure wooden doors that led to the primary classrooms. He was completely out of his mind, convinced that he was an invincible king merely claiming his rightful property. He violently kicked open the heavy secure doors, the loud sound echoing terrifyingly down the long, quiet hallway lined with colorful lockers and bright student artwork. He knew exactly which classrooms belonged to his children, and he was fully prepared to violently rip them away from their teachers. He imagined the absolute terror on Maya's face when she realized her precious babies were completely gone. He pictured Jerome finally begging on his knees, desperately offering hundreds of millions of dollars just to get them back safely. He felt a massive surge of dark, triumphant power coursing rapidly through his desperate veins. He took 3 heavy, aggressive steps down the long, bright hallway, fully expecting to reach the classroom door without any resistance. But before he could even take a 4th step, 3 massive, imposing figures silently stepped directly out of the shadows, completely blocking his path. Bradley abruptly stopped dead in his tracks, his toxic confidence instantly shattering into a million tiny pieces. The 3 men were absolutely colossal, easily standing over 6 feet tall and built like solid brick walls. They were all wearing flawless, custom-tailored black suits, crisp white shirts, and highly polished black shoes. They did not look like standard school security guards. They looked like an elite, highly trained military unit. They were Jerome's private executive protection team, and they had been quietly stationed at the prestigious school since early that morning, specifically to prevent this exact, terrifying scenario. The largest of the 3 men calmly crossed his massive muscular arms over his broad chest, staring directly down at Bradley with an expression of pure, icy indifference. "You need to turn around and walk directly back out to the front lobby." "Mr. Preston," the giant man commanded, his incredibly deep voice rumbling with quiet, dangerous authority. "You are not permitted to be in this restricted area, and you are absolutely not taking those children anywhere today." Bradley felt a sudden cold sweat break out across his pale forehead, but his blinding toxic arrogance violently pushed him forward against all rational logic and basic common sense. "You move out of my way right now," he screamed aggressively, pointing his trembling finger directly at the massive security guard. "I am a senior executive director, and those are my biological children. I have every legal right to walk into that classroom and take them with me. If you do not move aside this very second, I will have all 3 of you arrested for kidnapping and completely destroy your pathetic lives. The three massive men did not even flinch. They did not raise their voices or reach for any weapons. They simply stood together, forming an impenetrable, solid human wall between the unhinged, desperately toxic father and the innocent children studying quietly in the nearby classroom. "You no longer have any legal rights here, Mr. Preston," the large man replied, his tone remaining completely flat and utterly devoid of emotion. "Mr. Sterling clearly anticipated your desperate, erratic behavior. We have strict orders to protect the children using any necessary physical force. I highly suggest you turn around before you force us to completely neutralize the current threat you are posing to this entire educational facility." Bradley was completely cornered and entirely furious. He aggressively lunged forward, desperately trying to physically push his way past the three massive guards. It was a completely pathetic and highly ridiculous attempt. The lead security guard did not even have to try. He simply reached out one massive hand and firmly planted it directly onto Bradley's chest, effortlessly shoving the ruined executive backward. Bradley violently stumbled, falling completely backward and landing heavily onto the hard, polished floor. Before Bradley could even attempt to stand back up, the loud, piercing wail of approaching police sirens violently shattered the quiet suburban afternoon. The deafening sound rapidly grew louder and louder, stopping abruptly directly outside the main glass doors of the school lobby. Bradley sat on the cold, polished floor, his dark eyes darting frantically around the hallway. For a brief, twisted moment, his deeply toxic mind actually believed that the police were arriving to help him. He genuinely thought the terrified receptionist had called them, and he could easily spin another massive lie to completely manipulate the arriving officers into arresting the three massive security guards. He quickly scrambled to his feet, dusting off his wrinkled, borrowed suit, and aggressively fixed his messy hair. He plastered a fake expression of pure terror onto his sweating face, preparing to play the ultimate victim. 4 heavily armed police officers rapidly stormed through the secure doors. Bradley immediately rushed toward them, waving his hands frantically. The leading officer completely ignored Bradley's dramatic sobbing, marching directly toward him with an incredibly hardened expression. "Are you Bradley Preston?" the officer demanded, pulling out a legal document displaying a bright red court seal. "You are officially under arrest for violating an emergency protective order. Jerome quietly filed it this morning. Bradley's toxic plan completely backfired, trapping him in an unbreakable legal cage." The officer forcefully grabbed his arm, aggressively clicking the handcuffs tightly shut around his wrists. The heavy oak doors of the downtown family courthouse felt incredibly imposing as I walked through them, holding my head high. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the courtroom cast long, harsh shadows across the polished wooden benches. Today was the official emergency custody and asset hearing. I sat quietly next to my father Jerome at the plaintiff's table. My father wore his flawless, tailored navy suit, looking completely calm and utterly unshakable. Across the wide aisle sat Bradley Preston. The arrogant corporate executive, who used to wear $10,000 bespoke suits, was currently wearing a poorly fitting gray blazer that looked like it came from a cheap discount rack. His hair was a complete mess, and his face was pale and drawn. Because his high-priced shark attorney, Victor, had completely abandoned him, after discovering the forged marriage document, Bradley was now sitting next to a highly overworked and extremely exhausted public defender. But despite his entirely ruined state, Bradley's highly toxic, manipulative nature was still fully active. When the Honorable Judge Harrison, a stern older man with sharp, observing eyes, called the massive courtroom to order, Bradley instantly launched into the absolute performance of his lifetime. He practically threw himself upon the mercy of the court. Bradley stood up from his wooden chair, his shoulders slumped forward, playing the role of a completely defeated and totally broken man. He looked directly at the stern judge and forced heavy, dramatic tears to well up in his dark, manipulative eyes. "Your Honor," Bradley pleaded, his voice cracking with a perfectly calculated amount of artificial emotional pain, "I am standing before you today as a completely desperate father who loves his 2 young children more than anything else in this entire world. I have spent my entire adult life working incredibly hard, building a solid career, and providing a beautiful, comfortable life for my family. but my wife and her incredibly wealthy father are currently using their massive multi-billion-dollar corporate empire to completely crush me into the dirt. Bradley dramatically wiped a fake tear from his cheek, pointing a trembling finger across the aisle toward my father. They are an incredibly powerful and highly vindictive family, Your Honor. Because I am a simple, hard-working man who does not come from their massive elite background, they have always looked down on me. They are aggressively using their unlimited financial resources to illegally freeze my bank accounts, steal my home, and completely destroy my professional reputation. They are trying to forcefully tear my beautiful children away from me simply because I am not a wealthy billionaire like them. It is a massive targeted campaign of pure malicious revenge. They are using their immense wealth and deep societal power to silence a loving father and bury the truth. The sheer audacity of his disgusting lies made my stomach turn completely upside down. He was actively trying to flip the entire narrative, painting himself as the innocent victim of a wealthy, powerful black family who was ruthlessly oppressing him. He wanted the judge to see him as a tragic underdog fighting against a massive, corrupt corporate machine. His public defender sat quietly, looking incredibly uncomfortable, as Bradley continued to aggressively sob and beg for immediate full custody of the children and a massive emergency financial stipend from my family trust. Bradley claimed that he was currently living in absolute terrifying poverty and that the court had a moral obligation to protect him from our malicious financial abuse. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, weaving a deeply toxic tapestry of complete victimhood and calculated manipulation. The judge listened very closely, taking careful handwritten notes and occasionally looking over at my father and me with a completely unreadable expression. Bradley finally sat down, burying his face in his hands, acting completely overcome with profound emotional grief. It was an absolutely flawless, Oscar-worthy performance, designed specifically to manipulate the strict family court system. Bradley believed that his dramatic tears would automatically earn him the deep sympathy of the court. He desperately hoped that the judge would look at his wrinkled discount suit and feel profound pity for the man who was supposedly stripped of everything he had ever worked for. He truly thought his toxic racial and class-based dog whistles would successfully paint my father as a corrupt, ruthless tyrant. He completely ignored the massive, glaring fact that he was currently facing severe federal criminal charges for massive corporate embezzlement and violent domestic abuse. In his highly delusional mind, those federal charges were merely fabricated inconveniences created by our legal team. He leaned back in his stiff wooden chair and actually dared to shoot me a quick, arrogant smirk when he thought the stern judge was not looking directly at him. He was completely convinced that his manipulative sob story had successfully turned the entire tide of the legal hearing. He believed he had won the sympathy of the room. The judge slowly lowered his pen and turned his sharp eyes toward our table. He asked if my legal counsel wished to issue a formal response to the deeply concerning allegations presented by Mr. Preston. My highly expensive and incredibly skilled family attorney immediately leaned forward, preparing to completely dismantle Bradley's pathetic lies with massive stacks of verified legal documents. But I gently placed my hand directly onto my attorney's arm, silently instructing her to stand down. I did not want a lawyer to speak for me today. I needed to speak completely for myself. I stood up slowly from the heavy wooden table, smoothing my simple, modest dress. I did not cry and I did not raise my voice. I looked directly at the judge, projecting a sense of complete, absolute calm that terrified my arrogant husband. "Your Honor," I began, my voice echoing clearly through the massive, quiet courtroom. The man sitting across from me is indeed a masterful storyteller. But his entire narrative is built upon a deeply toxic foundation of absolute lies and terrifying psychological abuse. I have spent the last 10 years trapped inside a dark, terrifying emotional prison constructed entirely by Bradley Preston. He did not provide a beautiful life for me. He provided a constant suffocating nightmare of intense gaslighting and deeply cruel manipulation. He systematically isolated me from my friends and tried to completely destroy my personal self-worth. He constantly told me that I was entirely useless and deeply stupid. He relentlessly monitored my movements, controlled my basic finances, and treated me like a pathetic possession rather than a human being. The wealth he claims to have worked so hard for was actually entirely stolen from my father's company. His expensive luxury lifestyle was completely funded by his own massive corporate fraud. He never loved me, Your Honor. He only loved the immense power and deep control he felt when he was actively breaking my spirit. Every single time I tried to gently express my feelings, he would aggressively twist my words and completely convince me that I was entirely crazy. He made me genuinely believe that his cruel emotional abuse was actually my own fault. He wants you to believe he is a dedicated, loving father, but he is nothing more than a highly manipulative, toxic monster who only cares about feeding his own massive, fragile ego. I reached into my small black purse and slowly pulled out a tiny silver computer flash drive. I held the small metal device up so the judge could clearly see it. Bradley claims that we are using our wealth to maliciously crush him, I stated calmly. But the absolute truth requires absolutely no wealth to understand. Your Honor, I would like to formally submit this digital flash drive into the official court record. It contains completely unaltered hidden nanny camera footage taken directly from my own kitchen on the exact day I finally decided to leave him. The judge instructed the court bailiff to take the silver drive and insert it into the courtroom media system. A large digital television monitor hanging on the far wall quickly flickered to life. The entire courtroom watched in completely dead silence as the crystal-clear video began to play. The bright screen showed Bradley aggressively backing me into the kitchen counter. His cruel, hateful voice echoed loudly through the courtroom speakers as he called me useless and loudly bragged about making $1 million a year. And then the entire courtroom watched in absolute sheer horror as Bradley violently swung his heavy hand and brutally slapped me completely across the face, knocking me forcefully to the hard wooden floor. The video captured him leaning over my crying body, clearly admitting that he only cared about the money and telling my father that I would be left completely homeless. The video suddenly ended, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the room. The stern judge slowly turned his head to look directly at Bradley. The judge's face was contorted with absolute pure disgust and profound professional hatred. Bradley sat completely frozen, his pale face entirely drained of all blood, his jaw hanging wide open. Custody of the minor children is entirely and permanently denied, the judge boomed, his voice shaking with intense anger. The harsh reality of his monumental downfall had finally caught up to Bradley Preston completely. He was standing alone in the dimly lit parking lot of a cheap rundown diner on the dark outskirts of the city. The cold evening wind whipped through his thin, borrowed jacket, making him shiver violently. He had spent the entire afternoon desperately calling former corporate colleagues and wealthy friends begging for emergency financial loans. Every single person had immediately hung up the phone the second they heard his voice. He was entirely blacklisted from polite society. His massive legal bills from the failed family court hearing were aggressively piling up, and his highly expensive public defender was demanding an immediate, massive cash retainer just to review his federal criminal case. But the absolute most terrifying problem currently weighing heavily on his ruined mind was the massive underground bail loan. He had promised the violent lending syndicate a complete repayment of $200,000 in cash within 30 days. He had arrogantly assumed he would easily win the massive divorce settlement and pay them off with millions to spare. But because his fake marriage document was legally void, he possessed absolutely nothing. He had zero income, zero assets, and absolutely zero hope of ever repaying the massive criminal debt. He nervously paced back and forth across the cracked asphalt, tightly gripping his cheap, prepaid cell phone, and desperately trying to formulate a new manipulative plan. He thought maybe he could somehow convince the ruthless criminals to grant him an extended grace period if he promised them highly classified corporate secrets from Sterling Holdings. He was deeply lost in his toxic delusions when the loud, aggressive screeching of heavy tires violently shattered the quiet evening air. A heavily tinted black luxury SUV suddenly swerved directly into the empty parking lot, moving at a terrifyingly high speed. The large dark vehicle aggressively slammed on its heavy brakes, stopping just mere inches away from Bradley's trembling knees. His heart instantly dropped violently into his stomach. The heavy front doors of the dark vehicle forcefully swung open, and two incredibly massive men stepped out into the cold night air. They were the exact same dangerous debt collectors who had originally secured his emergency jail bail. They wore dark leather jackets, and their scarred, hardened faces held absolutely no emotion whatsoever. Bradley immediately began to take slow, terrified steps backward, holding his trembling hands up defensively in the air. "Gentlemen, please wait just 1 second," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking with pure, absolute terror. "I know exactly why you are here tonight. But there has been a massive legal misunderstanding. I just need a tiny bit more time to fully liquidate my hidden offshore corporate assets. I promise, I will give you $300,000 by the end of this week, if you just please give me a few more days." The larger of the two dangerous men completely ignored Bradley's frantic, pathetic lies. He reached into his thick leather jacket and pulled out a heavy, solid steel metal pipe. "We do not do extensions, Bradley." The massive man growled, his deep voice echoing chillingly across the empty asphalt. "You promised our boss $200,000 in cash by tonight. You do not have the money, so now we are going to violently extract the payment directly from your physical body." Bradley let out a loud, pathetic whimper and desperately tried to turn around and run away into the dark alleyway behind the diner, but he was incredibly slow and deeply exhausted. The second thug lunged forward with terrifying speed, aggressively grabbing Bradley tightly by the back of his cheap jacket and violently throwing him down onto the hard, unforgiving concrete. Bradley crashed heavily onto his knees, scraping his skin raw and crying out in pure physical agony. "Please, do not hurt me," he sobbed loudly, covering his head. With both of his shaking arms, "I am a highly respected corporate executive. You cannot treat me like a common criminal." The large thug, holding the heavy steel pipe, let out a dark, terrifying laugh. "You are absolutely nothing anymore, little boy." The thug sneered, stepping closer and raising the heavy metal weapon high into the cold night air. The thug swung the heavy pipe downward, striking Bradley forcefully in the ribs. The sickening sound of cracking bone echoed loudly through the dark parking lot. Bradley screamed in pure agonizing pain, collapsing completely onto his side and gasping desperately for clean air. The two massive men immediately began to viciously kick him over and over again, their heavy combat boots striking his stomach and his back with terrifying, ruthless force. Bradley coughed up a thick mouthful of dark blood, curling his entire ruined body into a tight, pathetic ball. He was now completely trapped, and he knew they were going to brutally beat him until he was entirely dead right. Now he had to escape, or he was going to die right there on the dirty concrete. As the larger thug raised his heavy steel pipe to deliver another bone-crushing blow, a loud, sudden clap of thunder echoed directly overhead, masking the sound of an approaching delivery truck. The bright, blinding headlights of the large commercial truck suddenly swept entirely across the dark parking lot, completely illuminating the violent scene. The two massive debt collectors momentarily froze, raising their heavy arms to shield their eyes from the intense, glaring light. Bradley knew this was his absolute only chance to survive. Adrenaline violently flooded his ruined system, completely overriding his agonizing physical pain. He desperately scooped up a massive handful of loose, dirty gravel and aggressively threw it directly into the unshielded eyes of the second thug. The large man roared in sudden pain, dropping his thick hands to his face. Bradley violently scrambled to his feet, his broken ribs screaming in pure agony, and sprinted blindly toward the dark, busy street. He ran with absolute pure desperation, his cheap borrowed shoes slipping against the wet pavement as the heavy evening rain finally began to fall. He could hear the loud, terrifying footsteps of the furious loan sharks rapidly chasing directly behind him. He pushed his exhausted body past its physical absolute limit, stumbling down the dark, wet sidewalk and violently gasping for oxygen. He aggressively rounded a sharp street corner, entirely desperate to find a police officer or a crowded public place. He stumbled toward a busy four-way intersection, his vision completely blurred with heavy rain and dark blood. Suddenly, a bright flash of luxurious white caught his frantic attention. Sitting perfectly still at the glowing red traffic light was a pristine brand-new Range Rover. He knew that expensive custom vehicle intimately. It was Maya's personal car, the exact same luxury vehicle he had arrogantly purchased using stolen corporate funds, aggressively sprinted directly toward the heavy traffic. He violently threw his ruined body directly against the thick passenger side window of the SUV. He pounded his bloody fists frantically against the reinforced glass, completely smearing his dark blood across the pristine surface. Maya, he screamed at the top of his shattered lungs, his voice completely ragged and pathetic. "Please open the door. Maya, they are going to kill me right now. You have to save my life." Inside the warm luxury SUV, I sat calm, untouched by the storm. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the absolutely pathetic excuse for a man violently slamming his bloody fists against my passenger window. His hair was ruined, plastered to his pale forehead with dirty rainwater. His face was swollen and bruised, covered in blood and mud. He looked like a wild animal begging for the mercy he never shown me during our marriage. He continued to scream my name, his terrified voice barely audible over the loud rain hitting the heavy metal roof. I simply stared at him, my expression completely empty of any sympathy. For a brief moment, I allowed him to genuinely believe that I was going to unlock the door and save his ruined life. I slowly reached my hand toward the silver control panel. I gently pressed the electronic button, rolling the thick, tinted glass down exactly 1 inch. The cold rain and sobbing rushed into my sanctuary. "Maya, please, I am begging you," he cried frantically, gripping the small opening of the glass with his bloody, trembling fingers. "They are coming for me. Maya, please let me inside." I leaned slightly closer, looking directly into his panicked eyes. My voice was incredibly cold, cutting completely through his weeping. "You are nothing without me, remember." I whispered softly, echoing the cruel words he had screamed at me. I pressed the button, rolling the window shut, forcing his bloody fingers completely away. The traffic light suddenly turned a glowing green. I pressed the gas pedal, driving the massive vehicle forward into the night. As I drove away, I glanced into my rearview mirror, watching the 2 massive thugs finally catch up to him violently, dragging him backward into the cold, dark shadows. The crushing weight of absolute poverty had finally collapsed onto Richard and Susan Preston. Exactly 30 days after their humiliating encounter at the massive Sterling estate, the brutal reality of their severe financial ruin became undeniable. Jerome's highly expensive and incredibly ruthless legal team had efficiently executed the massive foreclosure documents with extreme precision. The local county sheriff had arrived at their sprawling luxury property early that morning, with strict legal orders to force them out of their home. They were given absolutely no extra time to carefully pack their expensive designer belongings or contact any powerful friends for help. Susan wept hysterically on the pristine front lawn as aggressive moving crews forcefully loaded her precious antique furniture and expensive artwork into massive transport trucks that she no longer owned. Richard stood completely silent and entirely defeated, watching his fake upper-class empire crumble into absolute nothingness right before his very eyes. They were completely stripped of their massive social status, and their wealthy elite friends had entirely abandoned them the moment the terrible news broke. Their credit cards were completely maxed out, and their bank accounts were legally frozen by aggressive federal auditors investigating their direct financial connections to Bradley's corporate crimes. With absolutely nowhere else to go, the 2 ruined elites were violently forced to rent a single dark room at a notoriously cheap roadside motel on the very edge of the dirty industrial district. The heavy rain continued to pour from the dark sky as Richard struggled to carry 2 black plastic garbage bags filled with their remaining clothing up the concrete stairs of the filthy motel. The flickering neon sign above the motel office buzzed loudly, casting a pale pink light across the desolate parking lot. Susan followed behind him, shivering violently in the cold air. She was wearing a wrinkled beige raincoat over her expensive blouse, looking disheveled and out of place in the dangerous neighborhood. She stared at the peeling paint on the motel room door and felt a wave of physical nausea wash over her body. This was supposed to be their retirement. They were supposed to spend their final years drinking champagne on private yachts and bragging about their successful corporate executive son. Instead, they were standing in the freezing rain, completely ruined and disgraced. Richard fumbled with the room key, his hands shaking from exhaustion and emotional shock. He managed to unlock the wooden door, pushing it open to reveal a dingy room that smelled of cigarette smoke and industrial bleach. Susan walked into the room, dropping her leather handbag onto the floral bedspread and immediately bursting into tears. Before Richard could even close the door, a noise echoed from the walkway outside. Heavy, dragging footsteps approached their room, followed by a whimpering sound. Richard turned his head, looking out into the rain. Emerging from the shadows was a pathetic figure. It was Bradley. He looked nothing like the executive who used to command boardrooms. His suit was torn to shreds and soaked with mud and blood. His face was a disaster of bruises and swelling from the beating he had just received from the sharks. He was clutching his broken ribs with one arm, dragging his right leg across the concrete. Bradley stumbled forward, collapsing against the railing just outside their door. He looked up at his parents, his eyes wide with desperation. "Mom!" He choked out, his voice cracking with agony and terror. "Please help me, Mom! They destroyed me. The men beat me so badly, and Maya just drove away and left me to die in the street. Please let me come inside. I am in so much pain, and I have nowhere to go tonight." Bradley dragged his body closer to the doorway, coughing up another mouthful of blood onto the concrete. He extended his trembling hand toward his father, pleading for mercy. He believed that his parents would rush to his side and defend him just like they had always done his whole life. He expected his mother to cry over his wounds and offer him a place to hide from the consequences of his actions. He thought they were still his enablers. Susan walked toward the doorway, staring directly at the battered and bruised face of her only son. For her life, she had worshipped the ground Bradley walked on. She had protected him from every mistake, covered up his toxic behavior, and told him he was superior to everyone else in the world. But looking at him now, covered in mud and blood, stripped of his wealth and his corporate power, she did not feel a single ounce of maternal love. She only felt a profound hatred. The rage of her own complete destruction overtook her mind. She realized with clarity that this pathetic, bleeding creature standing before her was the cause of her miserable downfall. Because of his unbelievable greed and his incredible stupidity, she was currently standing inside a filthy, disgusting motel room instead of sleeping safely inside her luxury mansion. Susan stepped forcefully out onto the wet concrete walkway, completely ignoring the cold, heavy rain soaking her expensive, wrinkled clothes. Bradley looked up at her, his swollen eyes filled with desperate, pathetic hope. "Mom," he whimpered weakly, reaching his bloody hand toward her raincoat. But Susan did not reach out to lovingly embrace him. She raised her own trembling right hand high into the cold, dark air and swung it violently downward. The loud, sharp cracking sound of her hand, aggressively striking his bruised face, echoed brightly through the empty parking lot. The intense physical blow perfectly mirrored the exact same violent action Bradley had so callously inflicted upon Maya in their expensive kitchen. Bradley violently stumbled backward, completely shocked by the massive, unexpected attack from his own devoted mother. He collapsed onto his knees, crying out in pure, agonizing pain as his severely broken ribs protested the sudden sharp movement. "You stupid, arrogant little monster!" Susan screamed at the absolute top of her ruined lungs, her voice completely unrecognizable and filled with pure, toxic venom. "You completely destroyed our entire lives. We gave you absolutely everything, Bradley. We gave you the best education, the finest clothes, and the most expensive elite connections. You had a beautiful, quiet wife and a massive corporate career handed directly to you on a silver platter. But your disgusting, massive greed completely ruined everything. You just could not stop stealing. You just could not stop acting like a reckless, arrogant fool. You provoked a massive, powerful billionaire, and you dragged our entire respected family name directly down into the dirty, pathetic gutter. Look at where we are living right now because of your incredibly stupid, massive ego. I absolutely despise the very sight of your pathetic, ruined face." Bradley remained kneeling heavily on the wet, dirty concrete, his entire ruined body shaking violently with loud, pathetic sobs. He looked desperately past his screaming mother, silently begging his father to intervene and protect him. Richard slowly stepped out of the dark motel room, holding a small plastic shopping bag that contained the very few personal items Bradley had managed to leave at their house before the massive eviction. Richard did not look angry. He looked completely dead inside. His pale eyes were entirely hollow, reflecting the absolute total destruction of their fake upper-class empire. Richard slowly walked past his hysterical, weeping wife and stood directly over his kneeling, ruined son. "Dad, please," Bradley aggressively sobbed, grabbing desperately onto his father's wet pant leg. "Please do not do this to me. I am your only son. I will fix all of this, I promise. I will easily find a brilliant new lawyer, and we will somehow get the massive estate back. Just please let me sleep inside the warm room tonight. They will literally kill me if they find me out here in the dark street." Richard looked completely down at the pathetic, bleeding man begging on the dirty ground. He felt absolutely nothing. He calmly raised his arm and violently threw the small plastic bag directly into a massive, deep puddle of thick brown mud next to Bradley's knees. "You are no son of mine," Richard said, his voice sounding incredibly hollow and completely devoid of any human emotion. "You are nothing but a massive, toxic curse that completely destroyed our perfect family. Do not ever contact us again." Richard slowly turned his back and gently guided his hysterical, weeping wife back inside the depressing, dark motel room. The heavy wooden door slammed aggressively shut with a loud, final echoing thud that resonated through the empty courtyard. The loud, sharp click of the heavy metal deadbolt sliding firmly into place signaled the absolute total end of Bradley's privileged existence. He was now officially and entirely abandoned by his own toxic enablers, left completely alone in the freezing heavy rain to face the dark, violent monsters he had so arrogantly created with his own massive greed. The freezing rain had finally stopped by the time the gray morning light broke through the heavy clouds covering the city. Bradley Preston had survived the terrifying night by hiding inside a cold, damp concrete stairwell of an abandoned parking garage. His entire body ached with a profound, agonizing pain from the brutal beating he had received from the violent loan sharks. His expensive tailored suit was completely ruined, torn, and covered in dried mud and dark blood. His face was swollen and heavily bruised, making it difficult for him to even open his left eye. He had absolutely nothing left. His incredibly wealthy wife had driven away, leaving him to die. His deeply toxic parents had completely disowned him, throwing his meager belongings into the mud. The massive federal criminal charges for corporate embezzlement and domestic abuse were looming heavily over his ruined head. He knew that if he did not secure some form of legal representation immediately, he was going strictly to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his miserable life. The exhausted public defender assigned to his case had already warned him that without a massive cash retainer, she could not dedicate the necessary resources to fight the wealthy Sterling legal team. Bradley needed money, and he needed it right now. As he slowly limped out of the dark concrete stairwell, a sudden spark of desperate hope ignited in his toxic mind. He suddenly remembered a highly secretive financial account he had established many years ago, long before he ever met Maya, or manipulated his way into Sterling Holdings. It was a private retirement account, a hidden 401k plan, combined with a portfolio of independent stock options he had quietly accumulated during his early corporate career. He had intentionally kept this specific financial portfolio completely hidden from everyone, including Maya and his parents, specifically as a secret emergency safety net. He had always been a deeply selfish and calculated man, carefully hiding resources just in case his massive, arrogant schemes ever collapsed. He quickly calculated the current market value of the hidden assets in his aching head, estimating that the secret account must hold at least $75,000. It was absolutely nothing compared to the millions he had stolen, but it was certainly enough to hire a cheap, aggressive defense lawyer who might be able to negotiate a lenient plea deal and keep him out of a dark federal prison cell. Bradley dragged his broken body down the busy city sidewalk, completely ignoring the disgusted stares of the morning commuters rushing past him. He needed to physically reach the downtown financial district and speak directly with his private wealth broker to immediately liquidate the entire hidden portfolio. He stumbled into a dirty public restroom at a local bus station, stripping off his ruined suit jacket and desperately trying to wash the dried blood and thick mud from his swollen face using the cold running water. He slicked his dirty hair back with his wet, trembling hands, trying his absolute best to look like a respectable corporate executive instead of a homeless vagrant running from violent underground criminals. He took a deep, painful breath, ignoring the sharp, agonizing sting of his severely broken ribs, and began the long, grueling walk toward the towering glass buildings of the financial sector. Every single step was pure physical torture, but his toxic desperation pushed him forward. He imagined himself walking out of the prestigious bank with a massive cashier's check securely in his hand. He fantasized about hiring a ruthless legal shark who could somehow find a tiny, obscure technicality to completely dismiss the federal charges against him. In his deeply delusional mind, he still genuinely believed that he could completely outsmart Jerome Sterling. He still thought he was vastly superior to the quiet old black man who had completely destroyed his fake empire. He finally reached the massive polished glass doors of the elite private brokerage firm, his heart pounding violently against his bruised chest. He pushed through the heavy doors, entering the grand marble lobby that smelled of expensive cologne and old money. He approached the pristine mahogany reception desk, his dirty appearance immediately drawing the highly suspicious glare of the young security guard standing near the elevators. Bradley forced a painful, confident smile onto his ruined face, standing as tall as his broken ribs would possibly allow. He proudly stated his full name and demanded an immediate emergency meeting with his personal senior financial broker. The elegant receptionist looked at his torn clothing and bruised face with profound, absolute disgust, but she reluctantly typed his credentials into her secure computer system. Her manicured fingers paused over the keyboard, and a highly confused expression crossed her perfectly made-up face. She quickly picked up her desk phone and whispered frantically into the receiver, completely ignoring Bradley's arrogant demands for immediate service. After a few agonizing minutes of tense silence, she coldly instructed him to take the private elevator up to the 14th floor, where his senior broker was currently waiting for him. Bradley felt a massive wave of toxic, triumphant relief completely wash over his exhausted body, genuinely believing his desperate salvation was finally within reach. Bradley eagerly stepped out of the smooth private elevator onto the 14th floor, limping aggressively down the quiet, carpeted hallway toward the familiar corner office. He completely ignored the shocked and horrified expressions of the wealthy clients and expensive financial advisors passing by him. He aggressively pushed open the heavy glass door to his broker's private office, completely desperate to demand his massive cashier's check. His senior broker, a highly conservative older man named William, sat rigidly behind his massive desk. William did not stand up to greet his longtime client. He did not offer a polite smile or a warm handshake. He simply stared at Bradley with an expression of pure, icy professional detachment. Bradley threw his aching body into the plush leather guest chair, gasping loudly for clean air. "William, I need you to immediately liquidate my entire hidden private portfolio," Bradley desperately demanded, his voice cracking with pure panic. "I need every single penny transferred into a secure, certified cashier's check right now, this very second. I am facing a massive, temporary legal misunderstanding, and I desperately need the liquid capital to retain a private defense attorney today." William slowly took off his thin reading glasses and placed them carefully onto his immaculate desk. He picked up a thick, heavy legal file folder and looked directly into Bradley's manic, desperate eyes. "I cannot do that," Bradley Williams stated, his voice incredibly calm and completely devoid of any sympathy. "Your secret retirement account and your entire hidden portfolio of stock options no longer exist." Bradley completely froze, his exhausted brain violently struggling to process the devastating words. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, his face turning entirely pale. "Those are my private personal assets. I earned that money long before I ever joined Sterling Holdings. You have absolutely no legal right to touch my independent funds." William let out a heavy, disappointed sigh, slowly opening the thick legal folder. Yesterday afternoon, a massive team of highly aggressive corporate lawyers representing Jerome Sterling arrived at this exact office, accompanied by several armed federal agents, William explained coldly. They presented a massive stack of undeniable forensic evidence, proving that you had been actively commingling your stolen corporate funds with your private accounts to hide the massive digital paper trail. Because you used this specific financial institution to illegally launder the money you violently embezzled from Sterling Holdings, the federal government has officially classified every single penny to your name as the direct proceeds of a crime. Bradley stared blindly at the older man, feeling the small room rapidly spinning completely out of control. William continued his devastating explanation without a single ounce of mercy. Mr. Sterling's legal team successfully filed a massive emergency federal injunction, completely freezing your entire portfolio. Then the federal authorities immediately seized the full monetary value of your hidden stock options and your private retirement accounts to begin slowly repaying the massive millions you systematically stole from your father-in-law. You possess absolutely zero liquid capital, Bradley. Your accounts here have been permanently closed, and your financial profile has been permanently flagged by the federal government for severe corporate fraud. William slowly reached across his massive desk, pushing a single crisp white document toward Bradley's violently shaking hands. It was an official final invoice from the Federal Revenue Service. Because the embezzled funds were completely unreported income, you now personally owe the government exactly $500,000 in immediate severe tax penalties, William stated coldly. Bradley stumbled backward out of the private office, completely unable to breathe. He slowly collapsed, dropping heavily onto his bruised knees right in the middle of the crowded marble bank lobby, openly sobbing as his entire toxic life was now permanently, completely ruined. The bitter cold night wrapped around the stolen vehicle like a suffocating blanket as Bradley Preston sat alone in the dark parking lot of a cheap, run-down liquor store. He had absolutely nothing left in this entire world. His beautiful wife, Maya, had looked directly into his bleeding, bruised face and driven her luxury car away, leaving him to die in the dirty street. His toxic parents had thrown his meager belongings into a puddle of mud and completely disowned him. His hidden financial accounts were frozen and officially seized by the federal government, leaving him completely bankrupt. His prestigious corporate career was destroyed, and his public reputation was permanently ruined beyond repair. He raised a heavy glass bottle of cheap brown whiskey to his swollen lips, taking a long, aggressive pull. The burning liquid slid harshly down his raw throat, temporarily numbing the excruciating physical pain of his broken ribs, but doing nothing to stop the relentless agony tearing through his toxic mind. He was completely unhinged and entirely dangerous. His dark eyes were bloodshot and wild, darting frantically back and forth as he stared blindly through the cracked, dirty windshield. He violently gripped the black steering wheel, his bloody, bruised knuckles turning white from the intense pressure. He blamed absolutely everything on his father-in-law, Jerome Sterling. In his highly delusional and deeply narcissistic mind, he was still the ultimate innocent victim of an unfair conspiracy orchestrated by a jealous, vindictive family. He genuinely believed that the quiet old black man had maliciously stolen his perfect, wealthy life and intentionally turned his own wife against him. The dark, toxic rage boiling inside his heaving chest demanded immediate, violent retribution. He knew he could not legally fight Jerome in a pristine family courtroom, and he knew he could not physically intimidate him using aggressive underground loan sharks. But he realized he could still completely destroy the absolute physical foundation of the old man's commercial empire. Bradley knew exactly where the primary global logistics hub for Sterling Holdings was strategically located. It was a massive industrial warehouse situated on the desolate far outskirts of the city, holding hundreds of millions of dollars in highly valuable commercial inventory and countless expensive delivery fleet vehicles. He decided that if he could not have his massive stolen wealth, then Jerome Sterling was going to watch his own precious corporate empire burn directly down to the cold, dirty concrete ground. Bradley aggressively threw the empty glass whiskey bottle onto the passenger seat, where it shattered loudly and forcefully, slammed his heavy foot down onto the gas pedal. The stolen vehicle violently lurched forward, its tires screeching loudly against the wet, broken asphalt as he sped recklessly into the stormy night. He drove like a complete, unhinged madman running through solid red traffic lights and swerving violently across the empty lanes of the city highway. The freezing rain began to fall, once again, beating violently against the thin metal roof of the car and blurring his chaotic, tear-filled vision. He did not care if he crashed the car into a concrete barrier. He did not care if he died a painful death tonight. He only cared about inflicting the absolute maximum amount of total permanent devastation upon the powerful family that had stripped him of his toxic corporate power and immense social privilege. He successfully navigated the dark industrial roads with pure manic determination, his breathing incredibly shallow and dangerously rapid. The towering silhouette of the Sterling Holdings main logistics warehouse finally appeared through the heavy sheet of freezing rain. The enormous gray metal building stretched across several acres, surrounded by high chain-link security fences and dark, empty commercial parking lots. Bradley completely cut the bright headlights of the stolen car, aggressively parking it hidden behind a thick row of overgrown wet bushes near the back perimeter of the industrial property. He turned off the loud engine and sat quietly in the terrifying dark silence, his bruised chest heaving heavily with dark anticipation. He was going to burn it all completely down to nothing. He was going to reduce the billion-dollar commercial empire to a towering pile of worthless gray ash and melted steel. He slowly stepped out of the warm vehicle, the freezing cold rain instantly soaking his ruined, wrinkled, borrowed suit and chilling his broken bones directly to the absolute core. He reached deep into the messy back seat of the stolen car and aggressively pulled out a heavy solid steel crowbar and a massive red plastic canister completely filled with highly flammable gasoline. He had stolen the dangerous heavy supplies from a closed community maintenance garage earlier that evening specifically for this dark, twisted purpose. He violently dragged the sloshing gasoline canister through the wet, muddy grass, his damaged ribs screaming in pure, agonizing physical pain with every single labored step he took. He slowly approached a thick, reinforced steel side door located in the absolute darkest shadow of the massive, towering warehouse building. He aggressively wedged the sharp, flat end of the heavy metal crowbar directly into the tight, secure doorframe, violently leaning his entire ruined body weight against the cold, wet steel. The agonizing, sharp pain in his injured chest was absolutely blinding, but his toxic, manic rage and the cheap alcohol forcefully pushed him directly through the extreme physical torture. With a loud, harsh metallic snap, the heavy internal locking mechanism completely broke apart, and the massive steel door swung smoothly open into the pitch-black, silent warehouse. Bradley forcefully dragged the heavy red canister directly inside the building, carelessly dropping the metal crowbar onto the hard concrete floor with a remarkably loud, echoing clatter. The interior of the massive warehouse was incredibly vast and completely silent, smelling strongly of fresh industrial cardboard and heavy dark motor oil. Towering, endless rows of tall metal shelving stretched infinitely into the dark shadows, completely packed with highly valuable modern commercial goods and sensitive electronics. Dozens of highly expensive company delivery trucks were parked perfectly neatly in the distant loading bays, waiting for the morning routes. Bradley let out a dark, terrifying, highly manic laugh that echoed chillingly through the completely empty, cavernous commercial space. He truly felt like a massively powerful god of total, complete destruction, entirely in control of his dark, cruel destiny once again. He aggressively unscrewed the tight plastic cap of the red gasoline canister and began to violently sling the highly flammable toxic liquid completely across the commercial facility. He aggressively poured the strong-smelling amber gasoline completely over the stacked wooden pallets, violently soaking the highly expensive commercial inventory in extremely dangerous volatile fuel. He stumbled erratically and clumsily down the long, dark concrete aisles, carelessly splashing the dangerous toxic liquid directly onto the heavy, thick rubber tires of the parked delivery vehicles. The overwhelming, harsh chemical fumes quickly filled the tightly enclosed warehouse, making him feel deeply dizzy and completely lightheaded, but he aggressively refused to stop pouring until the massive red canister was entirely, completely empty. He violently tossed the empty red plastic container casually aside, heavily, listening to it bounce loudly and hollowly against the cold, hard concrete floor. He stood triumphantly in the absolute dark center of the massive warehouse, entirely surrounded by millions of dollars of highly flammable corporate assets soaked in highly volatile, dangerous gasoline. "This is exactly what you get, Jerome," he whispered directly into the cold, empty darkness, his ruined voice trembling with pure, toxic, manic joy and absolute hatred. "This is exactly what happens when you try to completely destroy a powerful man like Bradley Preston." He reached deep into the wet front pocket of his ruined suit pants and slowly pulled out a small, simple book of cheap cardboard matches. His bruised and bloody fingers were trembling violently from the freezing rain, the cheap alcohol and the massive, sudden surge of dark adrenaline rapidly flooding his completely toxic veins. He carefully bent back the small, wet cardboard cover, completely exposing the neat row of tiny red match heads. He absolutely knew that the exact second he dropped the brightly lit match onto the completely soaked concrete floor, the entire massive building would instantly erupt into a towering, uncontrollable, terrifying inferno. The resulting massive explosion would completely decimate the primary logistics hub and cause hundreds of millions of dollars in catastrophic permanent financial damage to the sterling corporate empire. It was his final absolute defining act of toxic supreme vengeance against the family that broke him. He smiled a completely wicked, broken smile and aggressively struck the small, tiny match directly against the rough friction strip. A tiny, bright yellow flame instantly flared brightly to life, casting dark, violent, dancing shadows across his heavily bruised and deeply ruined face. He stared at the beautiful, highly destructive little fire, completely mesmerized by the dark, terrible power he currently held directly in his violently trembling hand. He slowly began to open his bloody fingers, fully preparing to drop the burning match directly onto the gasoline-soaked floor and watch his terrible, violent revenge finally take glorious, permanent shape. But before the tiny piece of burning cardboard could even successfully leave his hand, the entire massive warehouse was instantly completely engulfed in a blinding, terrifying, massive explosion of bright white light. Dozens of massive industrial security floodlights mounted extremely high along the dark metal ceiling and across the high facility walls were violently switched on, all at the exact same, terrifying, synchronized moment. The sudden, intense, blinding glare completely blinded his dark, adjusted vision, forcing him to cry out in pure, terrified shock and aggressively shield his ruined eyes with his free, trembling hand. He staggered violently backward, completely disoriented and entirely physically terrified by the sudden, massive illumination. The tiny lit match slipped completely from his trembling, ruined fingers, falling totally harmlessly into a small, isolated puddle of plain rainwater, completely avoiding the dangerous spilled gasoline. A remarkably loud, booming voice suddenly echoed powerfully through a massive electronic security megaphone, completely shattering the tense, heavy silence of the large warehouse. "Drop your weapons and put your hands completely in the air right now," the highly authoritative voice aggressively commanded. As Bradley's ruined, watery eyes slowly adjusted to the blinding, intense white light, he looked rapidly around the massive commercial facility in absolute, pure, undeniable horror. He was absolutely not alone in the brightly lit warehouse. Emerging rapidly from completely behind the towering, endless rows of commercial inventory and confidently stepping directly out from the dark, hidden shadows of the massive parked delivery trucks were dozens of heavily armed tactical police officers and highly trained corporate security guards. They were completely securely surrounding him from every single possible visible angle, their dark, heavy weapons drawn and aimed directly at his heaving chest. The bright red laser sights of their tactical rifles painted bright, terrifying, glowing dots completely across his ruined wetsuit jacket. He had walked completely blindly and incredibly arrogantly directly into the ultimate final trap. The tiny unlit match slipped completely from his trembling, bloody fingers, falling totally harmlessly into a small, isolated puddle of plain rainwater, completely avoiding the dangerous, spilled gasoline. He stood completely frozen in the center of the massive warehouse, surrounded by heavily armed tactical police officers and highly trained corporate security guards. The overwhelming brightness of the sudden industrial floodlights was entirely blinding, making him violently squint his ruined, swollen eyes. He felt an incredibly deep, profound sense of absolute physical terror violently wash over his entirely broken body. The massive tactical rifles remained completely perfectly still, their bright red laser sights resting squarely against his heaving, ruined chest. He knew that if he made a single aggressive movement, they would shoot him completely dead right there on the cold, hard concrete floor. The incredibly loud booming voice from the electronic security megaphone echoed through the massive cavernous commercial space, once again commanding him to keep his trembling hands perfectly visible in the bright cold air. He slowly raised both of his bleeding hands, surrendering completely to the terrifying, overwhelming force that currently surrounded him. From the deep, dark shadows located directly behind the massive wall of armed security personnel, two distinct figures slowly began to step forward into the bright, glaring light. The heavy, rhythmic sound of their confident footsteps echoed loudly against the concrete, completely cutting through the tense, heavy silence of the massive warehouse. As they walked closer, the bright industrial lights fully illuminated their familiar faces. It was Jerome Sterling and his beautiful daughter, Maya. Jerome was not wearing his usual faded gardening clothes or a sharp, tailored business suit. Tonight he wore a heavy, dark winter coat over simple, dark clothes, holding his familiar old black flip phone, loosely in his calm, steady right hand. He looked completely untroubled by the massive, dangerous situation, entirely radiating a deep, profound sense of absolute, peaceful authority. Maya walked perfectly tall and incredibly strong directly beside her father. She was no longer the frightened, terrified woman who used to nervously walk on eggshells inside his massive luxury home. She was wearing a sharp, elegant, dark coat, her head held incredibly high, and her posture projecting an immense, undeniable power. She looked absolutely nothing like a victim. She looked like a brilliant, untouchable queen, entirely ready to claim her massive rightful empire. Bradley stared at these two powerful people standing confidently before him, his mind violently struggling to process the absolute massive depth of his complete, undeniable failure. He realized with horrifying, absolute clarity that this entire situation was not a lucky coincidence. Jerome had not accidentally discovered his dark, twisted plan. Jerome had deliberately left the primary logistics warehouse entirely unguarded on the perimeter, fully expecting Bradley to arrive here tonight in a state of absolute toxic desperation. The quiet old black man had completely anticipated every single frantic, desperate move his ruined son-in-law would make long before Bradley had even considered making them. The heavy steel crowbar and the massive red gasoline canister were not tools of ultimate vengeance. They were simply the final pathetic instruments of his own complete, absolute legal destruction. He looked desperately at Maya, hoping to see even a tiny fraction of fear or deep sadness in her beautiful dark eyes. He desperately wanted her to cry for him or beg her incredibly powerful father to show him some minor level of human mercy. But her eyes were completely, totally cold. They were incredibly sharp and entirely unfeeling, deeply reflecting the bright, harsh, industrial lights above them. She stared directly at his ruined, bloody face, observing his complete, total, pathetic downfall with the exact same clinical detachment she might use to watch a highly toxic weed being permanently pulled from her beautiful garden. He had spent 10 long years violently trying to break her strong, brilliant spirit, trying to forcefully mold her into a weak, pathetic servant who would blindly worship his fake corporate power. But in the very end, he was the one entirely broken, kneeling completely alone in a cold, dark puddle of rainwater, surrounded by heavily armed men waiting to drag him directly into a dark federal cage. The heavy, intense silence in the massive warehouse was incredibly suffocating. Bradley wanted to scream or violently lash out, but he was completely, entirely paralyzed by the sheer massive weight of his total permanent ruin. He simply stood there shaking violently in his ruined, wet-borrowed suit, his chest heaving heavily as the harsh chemical smell of spilled gasoline deeply burned his throat. He finally understood that he had never possessed any real, actual power. He had only possessed the massive temporary illusion of power heavily subsidized by the incredible quiet grace of the very people he had so arrogantly deeply despised. Jerome slowly took a single deliberate step forward, completely closing the short physical distance between himself and the entirely ruined executive. He looked directly down at Bradley with a gaze so incredibly heavy and deeply judging that it felt like an actual massive physical blow. "You really thought you could sneak into my commercial property and burn my entire massive empire to the dirty ground?" Jerome asked, his deep voice echoing calmly through the cold, bright warehouse. "You thought your pathetic little match would completely erase the massive criminal debt you currently owe to the federal government and to my family. You are incredibly predictable, Bradley. A weak man always tries to violently destroy what he cannot possibly build with his own two hands. You lacked the deep personal character to properly earn massive success, so you simply stole it. And when you finally got caught stealing, you immediately tried to violently burn everything down rather than face the massive necessary consequences like a real, actual man." Bradley felt a massive wave of pure toxic despair violently crash over his entire ruined mind. He dropped heavily onto his bruised, bloody knees, the rough, cold concrete aggressively scraping against his torn, expensive suit pants. He buried his ruined, swollen face completely into his trembling, bloody hands and began to scream loudly. A loud, terrifying, high-pitched wail of absolute, pure, unadulterated agony echoed incredibly loudly throughout the massive, cavernous warehouse. It was the truly pathetic sound of a highly arrogant, toxic narcissist fully realizing that his massive, fake world had officially, permanently ended forever. He screamed and aggressively sobbed his entire ruined body, shaking violently as the absolute undeniable reality of his dark, terrifying future finally crushed his massive, toxic ego. The lead tactical police officer rapidly stepped forward, aggressively grabbing Bradley's trembling arms and forcefully, violently twisting them behind his ruined, bruised back. The heavy, cold metal handcuffs were aggressively slapped onto his wrists for the final, ultimate time, the sharp, loud clicking sound completely sealing his dark, terrible fate. The heavily armed officers violently dragged his weeping, ruined body directly across the gasoline-soaked concrete, forcefully pulling him away from the incredibly powerful family he had so arrogantly tried to completely permanently destroy. He was completely finished forever. There was absolutely no escape from his massive, terrible actions. 6 agonizing months quickly passed, bringing the dark, terrifying nightmare to its ultimate final conclusion. The heavy oak doors of the massive federal courthouse completely sealed shut, locking Bradley Preston inside the cold, sterile judicial room. He was wearing a highly uncomfortable bright orange federal prison jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles securely bound by heavy, thick metal chains. He stood completely silently before the highly stern federal judge, his pale face entirely drained of all previous toxic arrogance. The stern judge looked down from the high wooden bench, his expression filled with pure, absolute professional disgust. "Bradley Preston, you have been officially found completely guilty of massive systemic corporate embezzlement, highly violent domestic abuse, and attempted felony arson," the stern judge announced loudly, his booming voice echoing harshly across the completely silent courtroom. "Given the incredibly severe, malicious nature of your massive federal crimes, I am officially sentencing you to exactly 20 long years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possible chance of early parole." Bradley felt his knees go completely incredibly weak, but the heavy metal chains forcefully kept him standing perfectly upright. He slowly turned his completely ruined head, desperately looking back toward the wooden public viewing gallery. He desperately hoped to see a single friendly face quietly crying for him, but the massive wooden benches were completely empty. His toxic parents had entirely abandoned him. His wealthy corporate friends had completely, totally forgotten him. He was entirely alone in the massive world. Maya sat perfectly quietly in the very back row, wearing a highly elegant, sharp-tailored business suit. She did not offer him a single tear or even a tiny brief glance of human pity. She simply stood up smoothly, turned her back entirely on the completely ruined man, and calmly, confidently walked directly out of the massive federal courtroom forever, without looking. 6 months have passed since the dark, terrifying night that completely destroyed the toxic empire of Bradley Preston and secured the ultimate safety of my beautiful family. The bright morning sun now rises gracefully over the sprawling, beautiful city skyline, casting a warm, golden glow across the towering glass and steel structures of the bustling financial district. The massive, pristine headquarters of Sterling Holdings stands proudly among the tallest buildings, a shining, magnificent symbol of pure resilience and undeniable enduring strength. The heavy, dark clouds of fear and suffocating manipulation have completely, entirely vanished from my life, replaced by a profound, deep sense of absolute clarity and incredible, boundless peace. I step out of the sleek black luxury car, feeling the crisp, cool morning air gently brush against my face. I am not the same timid, frightened woman who used to nervously walk on eggshells inside a massive, silent house. Today, I am wearing a razor-sharp, flawlessly tailored dark charcoal business suit that perfectly commands absolute respect and completely reflects my undeniable inner power. My dark hair is flawlessly styled immaculately, and my tall posture is completely straight, projecting an immense aura of deep, unbreakable confidence. I walk gracefully through the grand revolving glass doors of the massive corporate lobby, and the entire atmosphere immediately shifts. The dedicated employees and highly professional staff members politely step aside, offering warm, genuine smiles and deep, respectful nods of profound admiration. There is absolutely no fear in their eyes, only a deep, sincere respect for the woman who successfully reclaimed her powerful family legacy from the dark, greedy hands of a highly toxic monster. I confidently press the polished silver button for the private executive elevator, feeling a quiet, beautiful thrill of genuine excitement wash entirely over my calm, steady spirit. The smooth elevator rapidly ascends to the 50th floor, leaving the noisy, busy city streets far behind me. When the sleek silver doors finally slide smoothly open, I step directly out onto the plush, pristine carpet of the elite executive suite. The massive, heavy mahogany doors of the grand boardroom are already wide open, welcoming me into the incredibly vast, luxurious corporate space. The brilliant morning sunlight streams heavily through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, beautifully illuminating the long, polished mahogany conference table. The 12 incredibly highly respected senior corporate directors immediately stand up from their expensive plush leather chairs, entirely in perfect, unified unison. They do not look down on me, and they absolutely do not question my ultimate supreme authority. They bow their heads slightly, showing the exact same profound, deep reverence they have always shown to my incredible father. "Good morning, Madam Chief Executive Officer," the lead senior director says, his voice echoing clearly and respectfully across the massive, quiet room. "Good morning, gentlemen," I reply calmly, my voice ringing with absolute, pure, steady power and deep, resonant grace. I walk slowly and deliberately toward the absolute head of the massive mahogany table. I gently place my slim leather briefcase onto the highly polished wooden surface and gracefully take my rightful seat in the oversized, luxurious leather executive chair. The exact same powerful chair that Bradley had so arrogantly and foolishly tried to illegally steal from my incredible father. Sitting in this massive seat of immense global power, I feel a profound, deep connection to the incredible man who built this entire magnificent empire from absolutely nothing. My father, Jerome Sterling, is currently enjoying a highly peaceful, quiet retirement, actively tending to his beautiful blooming rose gardens and happily playing with his 2 precious grandchildren every single afternoon. He successfully handed the massive corporate keys directly to me, fully trusting my sharp, brilliant mind and my deeply compassionate heart to lead our massive family business into a bright, highly prosperous future. I look around the massive, quiet boardroom, looking directly into the focused, attentive eyes of my incredibly loyal executive team. We have completely successfully purged every single toxic element from this massive organization, entirely rebuilding our corporate culture on a solid foundation of absolute pure integrity and massive relentless hard work. The company is currently thriving far beyond our wildest financial dreams, completely free from the dark parasitic greed that almost violently destroyed it. I open my detailed financial portfolio, ready to officially begin the morning corporate meeting, completely embracing the massive, beautiful responsibilities of my totally brand new, intensely empowered, beautiful life. I am completely, entirely, absolutely perfectly ready to lead this massive, magnificent global enterprise into a highly successful, beautiful tomorrow. As I sit quietly in this magnificent room of immense global power, I find myself deeply reflecting on the true, profound meaning of family and the incredibly dark, difficult journey that finally brought me to this beautiful, triumphant moment. Family is absolutely not defined by the legal documents you sign or the simple biological ties you might share with heavily toxic individuals. True, authentic family is defined by the incredible, beautiful people who fiercely protect your precious spirit when you are too completely broken to defend yourself. For many long, agonizing years, I allowed a highly manipulative, cruel narcissist to systematically convince me that I was entirely worthless and deeply, deeply small. I so genuinely believed the deeply vicious, terrible lies he constantly whispered into my ear because I was completely terrified of the dark, violent consequences of standing up for my own fragile life. But my incredibly wise father quietly watched over me, patiently waiting for the exact perfect moment to entirely unleash his massive protective wrath. He deliberately hid his immense billionaire wealth and his massive corporate power, perfectly masking his absolute supreme strength behind a faded, dirty gardening jacket and a gentle, quiet smile. He allowed the arrogant, toxic monsters to completely, dangerously underestimate him. And when the dark, violent time finally came, my beautiful father systematically dismantled their entire fake, privileged world without ever raising his calm, steady voice. Never mistake a father's deep quietness for helpless weakness. The most incredibly powerful men in this entire world do not need to loudly brag about their massive strength or violently strike the innocent people they are supposed to deeply love. True masculine power is completely quiet, fiercely protective, and absolutely incredibly devastating when it is finally awakened by righteous anger. And as women, we must deeply learn to absolutely never let a weak, highly insecure man convince us that we are somehow smaller than we actually truly are. We hold immense, beautiful oceans of untamed, brilliant power directly inside our own beating hearts. We are entirely capable of completely saving ourselves and brilliantly running massive global empires. We simply must find the deep, incredible courage to finally, completely, firmly step perfectly into our own massive, brilliant, beautiful, blinding light. I will never again doubt my own incredible, immense strength or my totally absolute right to exist freely and beautifully in this absolutely massive, beautifully wonderful, glorious world. If you have ever bravely survived a deeply toxic narcissist who tried to completely destroy your precious, beautiful spirit, or if you personally know an incredibly strong, loving father who would absolutely fearlessly burn the entire world down to the cold, dirty ground just to completely protect his sweet, innocent daughter, then please hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to our channel right now. We constantly share these highly emotional, deeply powerful true stories because we genuinely want to completely empower absolutely every single beautiful person who is currently silently suffering in the dark, terrifying shadows of a highly abusive relationship. You absolutely need to deeply, clearly, completely understand that your incredible, precious human worth is absolutely not defined by those sad, toxic, blind people who completely, terribly fail to properly see it. Your immense, beautiful, brilliant worth is completely, entirely, forever defined by you and only you. Please generously share this powerful, highly dramatic story with absolutely anyone who deeply, desperately needs a strong, bright, beautiful reminder that they can completely successfully rebuild their own precious, beautiful life after a massive, terrible, devastating heartbreak. We absolutely love reading your incredible personal stories, so please drop a detailed, thoughtful comment down below and proudly tell us exactly how you finally broke completely free from the toxic, heavy chains holding you back. Remember to constantly stand completely, incredibly tall. Speak your powerful, beautiful, authentic truth, and never, absolutely ever settle for anything less than the massive, beautiful, joyful respect you truly, uniquely deserve. Thank you so much for joining me on this deeply profound, highly transformative, incredible healing journey today. Please stay incredibly strong, stay entirely beautiful, and always remember to fiercely protect your own lovely, peaceful, brilliant, glorious, and perfectly wonderful, deeply powerful, glowing, absolute, massive, bright spirit.